Chapter 255. This was an unparalleled sword stroke. To some extent, this sword stroke could be said to have appeared in the dark world for the first time. The scarlet sword edge was shining. The violent sword energy surged up and down in the air. The brilliant sword light of hundreds of meters almost brushed past the people of Zhongzhou State, with the inheritance and sword intent that had lasted for hundreds of years. Aldak's figure flew backward. The sword light swept past him and flew high into the sky. From a distance, it looked like a bright arc that seemed to cut the sky and the earth. The sword light rushed into the sky and cut the void. The dazzling sharpness and the starlight in the sky disappeared at the same time, leaving only darkness. Li Tianlan's figure appeared in front of the people of Zhongzhou State. Aldak's eyes were solemn and full of disgust. He was still staring at the direction where Dongqing Rushi was. The killing intent was rising and falling around him. "You want to save her?" Aldak looked at Li Tianlan and said in a cold voice. He was not handsome, and could even be said to be ugly. But no one felt that he was ugly when he stood there with a pair of red eyes and blood-red hair. It was a deep and extreme evil, exuding a power that made people feel fear from the bones. "I'm going to kill you." Li Tianlan's tone was almost casual and indifferent. Aldak's heart skipped a beat. From Li Tianlan's words, he did not hear the slightest anger or even the killing intent. All he felt was confidence. The kind of confidence that didn't take anyone seriously. "After I enter the invincible realm, I will be invincible in the world." Aldak smiled somewhat cruelly. He was ugly. When he smiled, his red eyes narrowed, and his whole face was distorted. He pointed in the direction of Dongqing Rushi. "Do you know what she is?" Li Tianlan's eyes were cold. "Illusion is a sin. She blasphemed against our faith." Aldak's tone was cold and ferocious. "She should be burned at the stake." Aldak, the killing angel of the Vatican, was known as the Eye of Killing. No one knew what he saw in his eyes, and no one knew what illusion was. In the crowd of Zhongzhou State, Du Hanyin turned her head and took a deep look at Dongqing Rushi. She didn't know what illusion was, but she was sure that Dongqing Rushi did want to kill Li Tianlan. Even though she didn't admit it, Dongqing Rushi was still confused. "I'm not your target?" Li Tianlan said coldly. He took a step forward, and the divine punishment sword in his hand trembled slightly. Aldak, Li Tianlan, Zhongzhou State. The three of them were not far from each other, but Li Tianlan was in the middle. For Aldak, it was like the end of the world. "It's you." Aldak took a step forward without flinching, a crazy and violent killing intent brewing in his body. "But when I bring you back to the church, I don't mind killing that heretic." Perhaps it was because the sentence was too long, or perhaps Aldak's Chinese was poor, he spoke in English. Li Tianlan didn't understand. There was nothing more to say, so he just drew his sword. Aldak's footsteps stopped. Li Tianlan suddenly raised the long sword in his hand. The starry sky was brilliant. The surroundings instantly became silent and dark. Within a radius of dozens of meters, all the light and air were forcibly squeezed out at once. Because the momentum was too fierce, the expelled air instantly turned into a terrible airwave. The airwave rose and impacted, and the entire remaining formation of Zhongzhou State suddenly began to retreat. Li Tianlan's figure was drowned by the absolute silence and darkness of the void. The sword light that had just lit up was completely dim. The void was silent. In the hot midsummer, the coldness advanced and retreated in the void. A cold current appeared in front of Li Tianlan. The endless coldness continued to spread in the void, and the sound of condensation began to be heard around. Aldak's eyes were solemn and bloodthirsty. Li Tianlan's strength was beyond his expectation, so he didn't hold back at the beginning of the fight. Go all out. This was his most powerful domain, a domain that was extremely condensed and shrank to a radius of dozens of meters, and also his most powerful unique skill. Ice-condensed tomb. The ghastly cold current suddenly broke out in the void. The void was frozen bit by bit. The dim sword light completely disappeared in the darkness. "Why don't you make a move?" Aldak suddenly roared, and his scarlet eyes looked at Tianhai Wuji and Lu Shengzangquan. There was a sudden flash in the distant sky. The saber and the sword were unsheathed in the night sky, with a clang that resounded through the whole battlefield. The saber light and the sword intent instantly approached Aldak's invincible domain. There was a dead silence in the ice-condensed tomb. A gust of wind suddenly appeared in the night sky. The gust of wind blew into the ice-condensed tomb. Tunhai Wuji held the long saber tightly, raised it above his head with both hands, and chopped down fiercely. The brilliant saber light was like a pouring river, surging and rushing to Li Tianlan, who was still carrying divine punishment. For Tianhai Wuji and Lu Shengcangquan, the remaining troops of Zhongzhou state were no longer a threat. Their biggest opponent was Li Tianlan. If they killed him, everything would be over and there would be no more waves. The gust of wind was approaching. The gust of wind was approaching. Aldak smiled cruelly, and he was about to make a move to kill. The completely frozen void of ice-condensed tomb suddenly began to shake, and a large amount of cold current began to break and break. The sword intent suddenly appeared in the area of dozens of meters. The extremely terrifying sword intent appeared in the void. Divine punishment was no longer glowing, but it was still rising little by little. This sword was very light, far less than the weight of the human emperor, but it was as heavy as a mountain in Li Tianlan's hand. Aldak couldn't imagine what kind of sword intent was carried on the blade. The sword intent was completely boiling in the void. Retreat! Aldak suddenly roared, turned around, and left. The long sword in Li Tianlan's hand had been completely raised. 21st Blade, Shatter of Land. In the map of God of War, the so-called mountains and rivers were the domains of the invincible realm experts. All the domains. In an instant, ice-condensed tomb was completely torn up by the sharp sword intent. The crazy sword intent filled the whole battlefield, and a large area of the mountain was violently surging under the sword. Dense cracks appeared on the ground one after another. The cracks were deep and ferocious, spreading in all directions. The soaring sword energy passed through the mountain area and entered the sea. The calm sea instantly set off monstrous waves that were dozens of feet high. The waves rose and fell, slamming on the sea like a mountain. The three invincible realm experts rushed to the sky at the moment when the sword intent broke out. The legend of Qin, hiding in the dark, was still silent. Li Tianlan held divine punishment and rushed to the sky. The sword intent rose on the ground and stirred up the sky. After killing Li Tianlan, the last battle would be completely over. For Li Tianlan, this was also the last battle. Break the mountain and overturn the sea. Falling stars and falling moon. The figures of the three invincible realm experts were getting higher and higher. Li Tianlan's figure kept going up with the sword intent. The night covered Changdao, and the white figure that kept rising seemed to be the most dazzling light in the whole dark world. The messy footsteps sounded under the turbulent night sky of the sword energy. Figures appeared on the battlefield one after another, gathering with the people of East Island and the 6 superpowers. The elites of East Island who followed Tianhai Wuji and Lu Shengcangquan to break out of Huading appeared on the battlefield. Not far away, Wang Tianzong and Dijiang were already close to the battlefield. Kill them. Wang Tianzong looked at the battlefield and said calmly, "Everything will be over." He waved his hand. Dijiang moved forward with a calm face. Behind him, the whole heaven punishment troop took a step forward at the same time. Wang Tianzong looked at them with deep eyes. He didn't look at Dijiang, the troops of Zhongzhou state, or the elites of East Island. He didn't even look at the battlefield. He stood very high. So as far as his eyes could see, it was all rivers and mountains, the whole world. His rivers and mountains, his whole world. After today, everyone would know that the final winner of the national plot of Zhongzhou state was the Wang family of Beihai, or Zhongzhou state. The sword intent above the sky had gone completely wild. No one could see the situation of the battle of the invincible realm clearly. The elites of East Island and the 5 superpowers started to move forward. They faced Zhongzhou state again. Without that young prodigy, their side was an overwhelming force. Zhongzhou state, you should be killed. At the front of the crowd, a relatively young superior of the half-step invincible realm walked forward slowly. He looked at the defeated soldiers in front of him, and his smile was cold and indifferent. Everyone in Zhongzhou State stood up and prepared for the battle with a calm face. The last battle. Another figure suddenly appeared in the air. A large area of air was twisting. Vast bolts of lightning fell from the sky like heavenly punishment. The thunderbolts finally condensed into a deep blue light beam from the countless electric lights. The light beam only left the sky among the crowd in the middle of East Island. A surge of power that made people despair instantly exploded in the crowd. There was a roar between heaven and earth. Countless elites of the 5 superpowers and East Island were completely drowned by the thunderbolts. Flesh and blood flew up, and there was a burning smell in the air. The thunderbolts fell. There was a large blank area in the crowd. Di Jiang's figure appeared on the battlefield. He stood under the several invincible realm experts in the air, but he looked down at all the people of East Island and the 5 superpowers. East Island, you should be killed. He squinted his eyes slightly, looking at the crowd below. Who are you? In the crowd, a young man who looked very young stood in the front, with vigilance and fear in his eyes. He was Crown Prince Rend. After Tianhai Wuji and Lu Shengzongquan left at the same time, the Crown Prince of East Island had become the person who could lead the battlefield. Uniform footsteps sounded before Di Jiang opened his mouth. In everyone's sight, hundreds of people, who looked like a whole, moved toward the battlefield step by step from afar. They were getting closer and closer. Their figures were getting clearer and clearer. Even the epaulets on their shoulders were getting clearer and clearer. Finally, someone called out their name in a trembling voice. That epaulet? It's the Wang family of Beihai. It's the Heaven Punishment Troop. The Heaven Punishment Troop. The silver epaulets reflected the light under the starlight, and the badges of firmament and sea made everyone's hearts sink suddenly. The Heaven Punishment Troop. The ultimate troop of the Wang family of Beihai, 300 people, no more, no less. But these were 300 people whose average strength was close to the peak of the fire-flaming realm. It was the average strength. Who knew how many thundershocking realm and peak fire-flaming realm experts there were in this troop? The most important thing was that they were an organized troop, not 300 people randomly gathered. The instinctive tacit understanding formed after years of cooperation made the enemy feel even more terrible than their realm. The number of people in East Island was still more than that of the Heaven Punishment Troop, but how could the whole be compared with many scattered individuals? I'm Di Jiang. Di Jiang finally spoke. He smiled and said, Commander of the Heaven Punishment Unit. He looked over the crowd into the distance and said calmly, From now on, the Wang family of Beihai will take over the special warfare system of East Island. A figure in white suddenly appeared in Di Jiang's sight. He appeared from afar, but quickly approached. A handsome, almost devilishly cold face appeared in Di Jiang's sight. We can't agree to this. He looked at Di Jiang and said indifferently, Daybreak, Sanluo Temple Master, asks the Wang family of Beihai to return to Beihai and Heaven Capital. He was not alone. Behind him, there was also a group of white figures. They were organized as one, and there were at least 100 of them. Di Jiang's eyes focused, but before he could speak, another voice sounded from another direction. Li Ming, Hall Master of the Life-Prolonging Temple, asks the Wang family of Beihai to return to Beihai and Heaven Capital. The sound came from the west. Di Jiang looked away. Another cold and proud voice rang out from the south. Phoenix, Master of the Deathless Temple, asks the Wang family of Beihai to return to Beihai and Heaven Capital. Di Jiang's expression turned completely solemn. Daybreak, Dawn, Phoenix. Limitless, Longevity, Undying. He had never heard of these code names, nor had he heard of these forces. But the crowd behind them was not fake. Behind the 3 of them, there was a team of 100 people. And their momentum was no less than that of the Heaven Punishment Unit. They also had epaulets. There was a silver arc embroidered on each of their shoulders, like a divine blade. Heaven Capital? After a moment of silence, he looked at Daybreak, who appeared first, and asked. Among the 3 superiors of the half-step invincible realm, only Daybreak posed the biggest threat to him. Although Dawn and Phoenix were strong, Di Jiang was still sure to win. This is the place. Daybreak's tone was calm. This is Changdao. Dijiang sneered and said in a sharp tone. From now on, this is Heaven Capital. Daybreak's tone was firm and steady. This is not the place where the Wang family of Beihai should come. In the whole world, there is no place that the Wang family of Beihai shouldn't go. Dijiang looked at Daybreak and said word by word. He clenched his fists tightly and looked at Daybreak. Who the hell are you? Chapter 256. Purgatory of Heaven Capital. When it came to his own organization, Daybreak spoke very slowly with obvious awe and arrogance. No one had heard of this organization before, but in an instant everyone carved this organization into their minds. This was the first appearance of the Purgatory of Heaven Capital in the Dark World. But they brought out a super troop that was no less than the Heaven Punishment Troop in terms of aura and number. The seventh day was nearing its end. The battlefield was silent. The elites of the Wang family of Beihai, Zhongzhou State, East Island, and the 5 superpowers, the Purgatory of Heaven Capital. The 4 forces stood in different directions, all of them deep in thought. At this moment, everyone could clearly feel the general trend in the Dark World. Night's spirit was annihilated. The Samsara Palace rose. East Island was turned upside down. The 5 superpowers entered East Island. A bloody battle broke out at the border of Zhongzhou State. Shinichi Miyamoto, an invincible realm expert, died. The young chosen one fought against 4 invincible realm experts alone. The mysterious but powerful Purgatory of Heaven Capital appeared in the Dark World. The general trend came head-on. The wind surged and the clouds surged. This was probably the most unstoppable trend in the Dark World in recent decades. After today, the entire Dark World would undergo great changes. Great changes were about to occur, and chaos was about to descend. Dijiang's face was solemn. His arm, which was much longer than an ordinary person's, hung down naturally and then clenched. There seemed to be a clap of thunder in the air. Dijiang's eyebrows arched as a towering battle intent erupted from his body and swept through the entire area. He was not as emotional as the others. The world was in chaos. But in the dark and cruel world of darkness, when had there ever been a golden age? The only thing he was thinking about now was that someone had stopped the Wang family of Beihai. The Purgatory of Heaven Capital seemed to want to monopolize the special warfare system of East Island. Zhongzhou State was plotting against East Island, and the battlefield almost involved half of the Dark World. Northern Europe, North America, East Island, and the borders were all fighting. Blood flowed like a river, and bones piled up like a mountain. At the last moment, the Purgatory of Heaven Capital, which had never participated in the battle, wanted to reap the fruits of victory. Who could accept that? Dijiang's fists glowed. Blue lightning flickered in his fists before completely vanishing. He seemed to be bearing something too heavy, and his entire body suddenly sank down. You want East Island? Dijiang looked at Daybreak. His gentle face was still calm, but at this moment, he only gave people the feeling of wildness. A suffocating power that was enough to oppress him surged around him. You think you're worthy? I'm standing here. This is Tiandu. Daybreak looked at Dijiang calmly. You want to fight? As he spoke, the elites of Sanluo Hall, Hall of Immortality, and Hall of Undying moved forward at the same time. They were in different directions. Now that they were walking over, they seemed to be surrounding the Heaven's Punishment Troop. Then let's fight. Dijiang sneered and stepped forward. Boom! A thunderous roar suddenly rang out as the world trembled. Dijiang's figure appeared in front of Daybreak. A large area of air twisted and exploded crazily. The void began to appear indistinctly. The moment the pure black spread quietly, it suddenly turned into lightning that covered the entire sky. It was as if the lightning that could destroy the world did not strike down in patches. Large patches of light and shadow rose and fell continuously, and the battlefield trembled violently under the lightning. The battle of the invincible realm above was faintly discernible in the void. There seemed to be only lightning, loud noises, and daybreak in the whole world. In the lightning, Daybreak's figure was still clear. The lightning destroyed the world. But he seemed to be standing outside the world. Dijiang's figure came to daybreak. In his sight, the pair of fists that could almost break everything smashed down with the most wild power along with the lightning. Dijiang was still in the half-step invincible realm, but what he showed at this time was no less than the combat capability of an ordinary invincible realm expert. Daybreak's expression was calm and relaxed. In terms of real combat capability, compared with Dijiang, he was indeed a little weaker, but only a little weaker. If they fought to the death, they would die together. What kind of gap was that? In Tiandu, he was not afraid to fight with Dijiang. But it was not necessary. He had a simpler and more direct way. Clenching his fists, he blasted over with endless power. Daybreak's whole body suddenly shook, and the lightning that was about to fall on him completely dissipated in an instant. Under the monstrous power, Daybreak's figure finally blurred for a moment. Then it was over. The lightning began to disappear. The loud noise suddenly dissipated. The battlefield was no longer shaking. Dijiang's figure was still standing in front of Daybreak. His fists blasted out, less than 5 centimeters away from Daybreak. But it was the distance between life and death. A gun appeared in Daybreak's hand. It was a blue gun, emitting endless mystery. The gun was like a short sniper, only over 1 meter long, only a little longer than Dijiang's arm. But the gun gave people the feeling that it was unusually heavy. The thick muzzle, the thick body, and every detail gave people a rough and cold feeling. The gun was silent. Daybreak held the silent gun forward and stabbed it directly into Dijiang's mouth. His face was calm, and his finger was placed on the trigger casually. The silent gun, the silent man. The picture froze completely for a moment. Only the gun in Daybreak's hand was changing. The blue body of the gun absorbed the starlight, and the blue became more and more brilliant, like a gorgeous shadow. There was no doubt that it was a murderous weapon. As long as Daybreak pulled the trigger, the power no less than the full blow of an invincible realm expert would completely burst out from Dijiang's mouth. Life and death were clear. Please ask the Wang family of Beihai to leave Heaven Capital. Daybreak held the murderous weapon and said in a calm tone, "You may not be reconciled before, but now your life and death are in my hands." For the combat capability of an invincible realm expert, what else is there for the Wang family of Beihai to be reconciled to? Daybreak opened his mouth wide, and the muzzle was put in. For a moment, he couldn't speak, but his breath suddenly became heavy. "Do you dare to shoot?" A gentle and calm voice suddenly sounded. Without any warning, Wang Tianzong's figure appeared beside Daybreak. During the whole process, Daybreak didn't even have time to react. Wang Tianzong didn't grab the murderous weapon in Daybreak's hand, but just looked at him quietly. Daybreak knew that he had lost the chance. But he still didn't take back the gun. He turned his head and looked at Wang Tianzong with a strange look and a little relief. "It turns out that His Majesty is here." He nodded and said to himself, "That's right. Lin Fengting had appeared in East Island from Zhongzhou State. Why didn't Wang Tianzong come?" Wang Tianzong shifted his eyes and looked at the murderous weapon in Daybreak's hand strangely. The blue spear seemed to be really spiritual. The blue flame flashed as if it felt threatened. The body of the spear became a little shorter again, but it became heavier. Wang Tianzong looked at it silently. He didn't look at the people from Zhongzhou State, nor did he look at the non-entities from East Island and the 5 superpowers. His appearance here had already explained one thing. Even if Li Tianlan was defeated and killed in the Battle of the Invincible Realm, the special warfare system of East Island would no longer belong to East Island. "It turns out that it's in your hands." Wang Tianzong said softly, "Amazing. You flatter me, Your Majesty." Daybreak's tone was flat and cold. "It's the murderous weapon that's amazing, not you." Wang Tianzong shook his head and looked at Daybreak. "You're not strong enough. If I want to kill you, you won't have time to shoot. Just like if the Wang family of Beihai wants to enter East Island, your so-called purgatory of Heaven Capital can't stop me." His tone was very gentle, but with a kind of spirit of a king descending to the world. "So, why do you want me to quit? This so-called Heaven Capital? Samsara Palace, Saint, please ask the Wang family of Beihai to quit Heaven Capital." Samsara Palace, military counselor, Please ask the Wang family of Beihai to quit Heaven Capital. Two voices sounded almost at the same time. Two figures appeared not far from Wang Tianzong. A black cloak covered their bodies. They looked at Wang Tianzong quietly, their eyes calm and deep. Samsara Palace. Military counselor, saint. There was an uproar in the camp of Zhongzhou State. This was the power that first joined hands with them to plot against East Island. But now, at the last moment, the super master of Samsara, who had never appeared on the battlefield, suddenly showed up and made his position clear. They chose to stand on the side of the purgatory of Heaven Capital. Choosing the Wang family of Beihai meant continuing to cooperate with Zhongzhou State. Choosing the purgatory of Heaven Capital. This was betrayal. For a moment, everyone felt suffocated. Wang Tianzong looked at military counselor and saint calmly. I knew that your thoughts were not simple. He said blandly, using the whole dark world as a chessboard and tens of thousands of elites as chess pieces, you plan to play with several countries, several superpowers, and several invincible realm experts in the palm of your hand. Such a plan is generous. Who is the mastermind? Qin Weibai? Your palace master? Or the purgatory of Heaven Capital? There is no plan. There is only fulfillment. Saint said in a bland tone. Wang Tianzong's layout was broad enough, but after all, he just got in touch with the plan of Zhongzhou State this time. If the plot against East Island was a plan, then the general trend behind the so-called plan could only be regarded as a half-step chess piece at best. Just a half-step. This was more than generous. Aren't you afraid that I will kill you? Wang Tianzong suddenly said, just you, even if you and the troops behind you, what can you do? I'm already here. I am here, and thousands of troops and horses, and I will kill them with one sword. Wang Tianzong, who had been quiet and hadn't really made a move for many years, finally showed the extraordinary atmosphere that belonged to the first on the divine list. The invincible realm expert was invincible in the world. Do you dare to draw your sword? Another voice suddenly rang out in the void. This voice seemed to come from the depths of the void and echoed in the whole world. No one could find his location. Wang Tianzong couldn't either. Time seemed to go back, to the moment when Wang Tianzong appeared. At that moment, Wang Tianzong asked Daybreak, do you dare to shoot? But this time, the person hiding in the dark didn't show up. Even Wang Tianzong didn't find his location. This voice didn't belong to the master of Samsara Palace. There was no doubt that it should belong to the superior of the invincible realm behind the purgatory of Heaven Capital. Who is it? Wang Tianzong said in a calm tone, come out and meet me. Are you sure you want to see me? The voice in the void rang out once more. There was no emotion in it, and the words revealed an extremely pure indifference. Before Wang Tianzong spoke, a clear sound of friction had sounded. It was the subtle sound of the weapon being dragged on the ground and rubbing against the ground. But now, this subtle sound was spreading throughout the entire world in a subtle yet ubiquitous manner. The sound of friction gradually approached. The air began to turbulence. The sound of friction turned into a sound of breaking. The sound gradually expanded and suppressed the battlefield on the ground. At the same time, it instantly suppressed the mighty sword intent and the cracking sound of the battle of the invincible realm in the air. Only the sound of breaking friction sounded in the whole world, with the sharpness that had been hidden for many years. Puff! In the camp of the Heaven Punishment Troop, at the moment when the sound of friction gradually approached, several elite soldiers standing on the edge were directly cut into countless pieces by the invisible sharpness that filled the world without moving. The moment the blood mist rose, Wang Tianzong narrowed his eyes with a cold expression. An irregular arc appeared in the void. It looked like the edge of a weapon, and it was completely black. The blade crossed the air, with the sound of friction echoing all over the world, becoming more and more obvious. All the elites of the Sanluo Hall, the Life-Prolonging Hall, and the Athanasia Hall began to bow deeply in one direction, looking pious and awestruck. The blade in the air was completely clear. A figure gradually became clear. It was so clear that people felt that the whole world around them was fake. Everyone seemed to become illusory in an instant. Only Wang Tianzong was still real. A black shadow slowly walked to the front of Wang Tianzong, stepping on the void as if walking on the ground. Everyone finally saw his weapon clearly, and great astonishment rose in the hearts of the crowd. It was a weapon that few people in the dark world used, or even no one used it at all. That was a scythe. A death scythe that was nearly 3 meters long. The sharp and irregular blade was curved, spreading horizontally for nearly 2 meters. He held the scythe, dressed in black, like a real death, powerful and almost irresistible. "What's your name?" Wang Tianzong's tone was calm, without sadness or joy. "Deity." The black shadow holding the death scythe said coldly, like a deity. Wang Tianzong didn't speak. "This is heaven capital." Deity's tone was indifferent, with irresistible strength. "Get out." "Your weapon is interesting," Wang Tianzong suddenly said. "Do you want to have a try?" Deity's tone didn't change at all. It was indifference, as if he regarded everything as nonentities. "I never let myself regret," Wang Tianzong said. "Since you want to take East Island, let's bet on a sword stroke. I have a sword stroke. If you can take it, I will get out of your heaven capital. If you can't, you stay here." This world doesn't need deity or the purgatory of heaven capital. Under the black cloak, Deity's head seemed to move. He looked at Wang Tianzong and said coldly, "Do it." There was no hesitation, no nonsense, no probing. Wang Tianzong pulled out his long sword with a calm expression. The sword was called Listen to the Sea. The whole mountain area suddenly became dead silent. The sea in the distance suddenly surged up. Wang Tianzong looked at Deity in front of him, his eyes calm and emotionless. He had never seen the death scythe, but his intuition told him that the deity in front of him was somewhat familiar. He didn't want to test anything, and he didn't test anything with his sword. There was only life and death. "Anyone who is my enemy deserves to die." Listen to the Sea slowly came out of the sheath. The bright sword light that could compete with the sun and the moon lit up. He bet on a sword stroke with the whole East Island. This sword stroke. Chapter 257. Facing the most elite force of the entire purgatory of heaven capital and the familiar enemy, Wang Tianzong's expression was as calm as water. It could be said that it was the biggest gamble in the dark world in recent decades to bet on the power of the secret service system of a country with a sword. But neither Wang Tianzong nor Deity, who held the death scythe, thought of changing the battlefield. Right here, under the general trend, in front of everyone's eyes. One sword strike determined life and death. One sword strike determined the outcome. If Deity could take this sword strike, the Wang family of Beihai would completely withdraw from East Island and Deity's heaven capital. With the strength shown by Deity and the hidden strength of the purgatory of heaven capital, even if Tianhai Wuji and Lusheng Sanquan could defeat Li Tianlan, no one could stop him from rising in East Island. But if Deity couldn't take this sword strike, he himself and the most elite force of the purgatory of heaven capital would vanish in this sword strike, leaving nothing. The most astonishing bet would naturally trigger the battle at the peak of the dark world. Deity and Sword Emperor. Listen to the Sea was unsheathed inch by inch. There was no sound, but the sword light was comparable to the sun and the moon, shooting straight into the sky. The noise of the whole battlefield was completely suppressed in an instant, and the world began to freeze. The air was stirred up and completely broken. There was no void in the battlefield, but the unimaginably sharp and heavy sword intent replaced the air and occupied every inch of space in the whole battlefield. Deity's body was wrapped in a black cloak, so no one could see his expression clearly. They only saw that his hand holding the death scythe gently lifted up. No matter how this posture was interpreted, it could not be regarded as fear of battle. The martial arts of the Wang family of Beihai focused on outbreak. For them, if they fought with all their strength, there was not much difference between one sword strike and 100 sword strikes. The result of this battle was related to the power of the East Island Special Warfare System and the rise and fall of the purgatory of heaven capital. In this case, Wang Tianzong's sword strike was bound to be the strongest of the Wang family of Beihai, similar to the legendary 6 paths of reincarnation. But Deity chose to fight. How confident was he? Wang Tianzong's eyes narrowed, and there seemed to be a smile at the corner of his mouth. With a faint smile on his face, Listen to the Sea's sword fell down calmly. No one could see the mystery of this sword strike. In everyone's eyes, it was casual and even a little weak. The blade cut through the night sky, slowly and quietly. The world had always been quiet. However, the sword light that filled the sky erupted hysterically in the craziest and most extreme way in an instant. It was like the Milky Way pouring down, like the sky collapsing. The stars twinkled, and the moon shone brightly. All the light was instantly suppressed by the sword light. The entire world remained silent. Only the sea-like light was constantly gathering on the blade of the Listen to the Sea sword. Listen to the Sea's blade grew brighter and brighter, but it still slashed down slowly and powerlessly. Deity stood where he was and looked at the blade that was falling slowly. His eyes were dazed and full of emotion. The sword Listen to the Sea was surprisingly slow, but the whole world was completely blocked. There was no way out. Deity had no way out except to fight back. This was an unavoidable strike. The Listen to the Sea sword fell from Wang Tianzong's head to his shoulder. The sword light that seemed to carry the whole world suddenly disappeared. The world was still peaceful, but everywhere was deathly still and dark. It was an indescribable despair. There was no light or sound in the world. The sound of breathing stopped, and the heartbeat seemed to have completely disappeared. Nothing could be seen or heard. Time seemed to be shuttling back and forth in the almost endless darkness and silence. An eternal moment. This was an indescribable despair and fear. Countless people subconsciously took a step forward in horror. Puff! The sword light that filled every inch of heaven and earth suddenly surged. Anyone who tried to make other moves was instantly torn into pieces by the sharp sword intent. It was strong and domineering, almost ignoring the realm. Chi-controlling realm, ice-condensing realm, fire-flaming realm, thunder-shocking realm, and even invincible realm. Under this sword, everyone was a nonentity. The darkness continued, and there was no end. A divine blade suddenly lit up in the darkness that seemed to last until the end of time. That was the blade of the death scythe. Deity raised his arm. The surging sword intent around him was completely shattered in an instant. One after another, dazzling light in the absolute darkness lit up around him. The death scythe was like a real peerless divine blade, and the wild sword intent rose to the sky in an instant. The death scythe rushed into the air. Deity's hands began to make a gesture. The light became more and more dazzling. Eternal light. Eternal darkness. Only those who witnessed the battle with their own eyes could clearly understand that regardless of whether it was darkness or light, they were both harmful to ants. Light and darkness were in a stalemate. Listen to the Sea fell on Wang Tianzong's shoulder. A dark, almost imperceptible giant sword shadow chopped at Deity's death scythe. The giant sword almost occupied the whole battlefield, and all the darkness was like a hole, pressing down with the giant sword. It was as if the whole world was collapsing, being destroyed and dying. Countless complicated and mysterious handprints bloomed in Deity's hands. The death scythe flying in the void suddenly began to shake wildly. Different sword intents were madly released in the death scythe. Zhuanyuantai, Mount Shu, Jade Pool, Azura Path, Jifeng Sword Raining School, Sai City, the Vatican, the Jiang family of South America, Fantasy World. 9 different sword intents suddenly flew up with the completion of Deity's gesture. The other party didn't seem to be particularly proficient in each sword intent, but with his strong strength, the power of each sword intent was raised to an incredible realm. Unique skill, 9 emptiness and infinity. The 9 sword intents began to merge at the same time. The death scythe suddenly cut through the sky, bringing with it a brilliant light as it pierced through the endless darkness. A large area of darkness was dissipating. The giant sword shadow fell with the darkness and suddenly collided with the death scythe. In silence, darkness and light completely merged and exploded, and the giant sword shadow was torn apart. But at the moment when the darkness retreated, Listen to the Sea in Wang Tianzong's hand had almost completely fallen. The collapsed darkness surged wildly in the light, and the sword intent rushed to the ninth heaven. After the giant sword was broken, 6 smaller giant swords with stronger sword intent were formed in an instant. 6 different sword intents were mighty in the darkness. They all belonged to the Wang family of Beihai. 6-path sword of the Wang family of Beihai. 6 paths of reincarnation. 6 giant swords fell madly with a large area of darkness. In the intertwining of darkness and light, the whole battlefield kept shaking like an earthquake, but no sound could be heard. The 6 giant swords seemed to carry thousands of worlds with them as they kept falling down. One mountain area after another was flattened. Large areas of forests disappeared completely. The fertile land was turned into scorched earth, and the scorched earth was turned into yellow sand that connected to the beach. The waves on the beach rushed to the sky like crazy. 6 giant swords grew and reincarnated continuously, as if they were tirelessly chopping toward Deity in the center. Deity held his death scythe. The death scythe kept waving in the vast sword intent and sword shadow, like a lonely boat in the sea. But beams of light were in a stalemate with the 6 giant swords in the darkness, with the spirit of tearing the world apart. Although they couldn't move forward, they wouldn't retreat. Light flashed in Wang Tianzong's eyes, and the hand holding the sword suddenly clenched. The 6 giant swords in the darkness vibrated at the same time and suddenly chopped down at the same time. The sky fell and the earth cracked. The death scythe, which was more than 3 meters long in Deity's hand, suddenly vibrated. His figure seemed to be stiff, but the 6 giant swords that fell at the same time also suddenly trembled. Collection of all things. Emptiness and infinity made 9 different sword intents work at the same time. Collection of all things was to borrow the enemy's power for one's own use. The 6 giant swords were completely broken in an instant. The surging darkness wrapped over, and the great power seemed to be completely added to Deity's body. Listen to the sea in Wang Tianzong's hand finally fell completely. The long sword returned to the sheath. A clear clang finally sounded between heaven and earth. The power that had been completely detonated in collection of all things merged again in an instant. 6 paths became one. The sword intent that seemed to have exploded to the extreme rose again in an instant. At the moment when darkness and light alternated wildly, the constantly flashing world blurred everything. Deity seemed to make a seal again. After collection of all things. It was immortality. The darkness spread silently, and no one could see the battlefield clearly anymore. In the strange scene that should have been earth-shaking but silent, darkness and light began to dissipate at the same time. But the sword intent that almost shattered the whole world rose up and filled the sky and the earth. The battlefield was completely quiet. The people on the ground didn't dare to move. The battle of the invincible realm experts in the air also stopped. Several invincible realm experts also didn't dare to move. The black and white disappeared completely. The figures of Sword Emperor and Deity reappeared. Deity's body stood steadily in the void. Wang Tianzong's expression didn't change. The two of them looked at each other from a distance, standing under the bright starry sky again. It was so real. In reality, other people seemed to have become decorations without any breath of life. It's still a sword after all. Wang Tianzong finally spoke. His tone was calm and calm. Not strong. Deity asked back. Very strong. Wang Tianzong said solemnly. So what if it's still a sword? Deity's tone became colder and colder. Wang Tianzong was silent for a while, nodded, and sighed. It makes sense. He looked at Deity in his sight and said calmly, what happened in the past? The people in the past have passed away. Why talk about what happened in the past? Ridiculous. Deity's tone was cold. He raised the death scythe in his hand again and pointed at Wang Tianzong. Take your people and get out. Bang. In the slight sound, a crack appeared on the blade of the death scythe in Deity's hand, and then the whole huge death scythe completely collapsed. The listen to the sea sword in Wang Tianzong's hand was also collapsing. You're just an illusion, also. Before Wang Tianzong finished his words, he was interrupted by Deity indifferently. Aren't you the same? While speaking, the weapons in their hands, their clothes, their bodies, and their limbs were constantly dissipating. There was no blood falling in the air, but the two of them were collapsing little by little in the sight of the crowd. "I quit your heaven capital." Wang Tianzong said so before his voice disappeared. Perhaps only a few people present knew how confident and strong Wang Tianzong was when he said to quit. The battlefield was completely quiet. This was perishing together. Everyone was in an uproar. In the entire crowd, Qin Weibai was probably the only one who remained calm and collected. Because from the beginning, she did not look at the battlefield. When Li Tianlan was there, her eyes seemed to always focus on Li Tianlan. The figures of Wang Tianzong and deity completely disappeared in the night wind, but the sword intent still did not dissipate. The seemingly gentle but actually sharp sword intent filled every inch of space in the sky and on the ground. The moment the sword intent finally broke out, it rushed up to the sky and stopped the extremely fierce battle of the invincible realm. At this moment, no matter Tianhai Wuji, Lusheng Zhangquan, Aldak or Li Tianlan, no one dared to act rashly. Because everyone still had the sword intent of the two masters around them. If they moved one step, they might be seriously injured or doomed eternally. Because the enemy was on the side. That is, Tianhai Wuji stared at the direction where Wang Tianzong and deity disappeared. His eyes were full of despair, as if he had seen a ghost. Only Li Tianlan remained calm. In his current strange state, from the moment when Wang Tianzong and deity fought, he already knew that everything was fake. Or in other words, they were all illusions. Such a real deity and Wang Tianzong were all illusions. From the beginning to the end, neither deity nor sword emperor really appeared on the battlefield. What appeared on the battlefield was one of their sword essences, their strongest sword essences. This sword strike was their sword intent fighting with each other. No matter how powerful an invincible realm master was, it was impossible to completely shape his own appearance with a sword intent. After all, a man was a man, and it was impossible to have any incarnation. But at the level of Wang Tianzong and deity, their understanding of the sword and the void had reached the peak. What appeared on the battlefield was always sword intent. They just used the reflection formed by the distortion of the void and sword intent to deceive everyone's eyes. It was like a magic trick. But it was a magic trick after the combat capability reached the peak. They couldn't tell the illusion from the reality, not because the magic trick was good, but because they weren't strong enough. That was all. So in the case that most people didn't know, from the beginning to the end, deity and Wang Tianzong knew each other. They were all illusions. Li Tianlan saw the illusion and also the reality. Vaguely, he seemed to see the commanding heights of the real combat capability. When he could only see two sword intents at a glance, instead of two figures, he really deserved the title of Heavenly Son. He was now invincible realm. But after all, he couldn't be invincible. The remaining sword intent of the enemy could make him not dare to act rashly. How could he have the face to call himself invincible? Li Tianlan laughed. His smile was a little crazy and angry, but the arrogance and humiliation were clearly shown in front of everyone. He had no hope in this life, but he was never really invincible. He saw the real road, but he couldn't walk on it. What was it that he was pursuing? He was in the invincible realm, but he was trapped in the enemy's sword intent and didn't dare to move. Why? Li Tianlan suddenly took a step forward. The remaining sword intent surged wildly in an instant, and his internal organs were severely injured in almost an instant. Li Tianlan's eyes were unprecedentedly cold. Even without the sword intent, he would die today. What did he need to worry about? The sword intent all over the sky strangled madly. The sword intent was completely attracted. Aldak, who felt the restraint instantly lightened, rushed to the seriously injured Li Tianlan without hesitation. Li Tianlan calmly drew his sword. The first blade Wuji. A faint light began to rise from the divine punishment. Li Tianlan took a second step forward, wrapped in the remaining sword intent all over the sky, and suddenly changed his sword style. Peerless sword. The 22nd blade, break of the sky. In an instant, a dazzling light lit up in the silent midair. The absolute light seemed to be pushed to the real extreme in an instant. The sky was broken under the sword. The void disappeared under the sword. The sword light advanced fiercely, and everything about Li Tianlan was completely out of control. In an instant, the sword light seemed to break through all the shackles. Vaguely, the remaining sword intent in the air was rumbling. The 22nd blade went straight to the peak in an instant. The scarlet long sword arrived in front of Aldak at the moment when Li Tianlan took the second step. Buzz! On the distant sea, a clear sound that had been silent for too long suddenly sounded. As far as the eye could see, there was a bright silver light on the sea. The waves kept surging under the silver light, and the big waves hit the sky. A dazzling silver disk quietly rose above the boundless sea. The bright moon rises on the sea. A full moon, with irresistible power and countless residual shadows, suddenly approached Li Tianlan. When he was seriously injured by the sword intent. When he had no time to care about anything else. The legend of Qin. This murderous weapon, which had been silent in the dark world for too many years, seized the best opportunity and fired without any hesitation. Bang! The bright moon was rising. Another clear and heart-shaking rumble rang out. The bright moon rose above the sea. A faint blue color suddenly appeared in the mountainous area. A faint blue color that made everyone's scalp numb rushed straight to the sea from the mountainous area. The blue line went straight forward. The air was completely twisted and shattered as the blue line moved forward. For a moment, the whole mountainous area seemed to be decomposed into a large area of faint blue. The blue line scattered and merged in the void, tearing everything with shadows and hitting the bright moon in an instant. Shadow Ripper! Above the sea, Evil suddenly let out an incredible roar. Daybreak held the murderous weapon in his hand that had already fired, spat out a mouthful of blood, and fell down on his back. The blue line hit the center of the bright moon. Countless flames flooded the sea in an instant. The moment the huge waves rose, the 22nd blade, whose power had been increased to the extreme, suddenly pierced Aldak's neck. The sharp edge of the sword swept past. The head of Aldak, the killing eye, the killing angel of the Vatican, the 9th on the divine list, flew up with a large amount of blood. The sword intent around Li Tianlan surged wildly, and the sword light of the 22nd blade was still bright. In the sword light and sword energy, Li Tianlan suddenly let out a long roar that could break gold and stone. The sword momentum of the 22nd blade changed again. The 5th blade, flying snow. The midsummer night sky instantly became bone-piercingly cold. Countless sword intent whistled like frost, and then directly became cold. Under the bright moon, among the stars, the night sky began to snow. The snow was like goose feathers, flying and falling. But what made everyone tremble was that the sword intent that turned into flying snow was not Li Tianlan's sword intent. It was the sword intent that had been whistling around him. The sword intent that belonged to deity and Wang Tianzong. He borrowed the enemy's sword intent for his own use. At the most critical moment, the most abrupt turning point, a moment was enough. In the heavy snow, Li Tianlan's roar had not died away, and the sword rose again. The remaining sword intent left by deity and Wang Tianzong completely broke out. The snowflakes poured down, and Tianhai Wuji and Lusheng Zhangxuan were directly swept away. Li Tianlan's figure was like a shocking rainbow, breaking into the sea in the twinkling of an eye. It was still the 22nd blade. It was still the breaking of the sky. A sword light as long as 1,000 feet suddenly rose above the sea. The sword light shone on the world, breaking everything. The raging flame and the rising waves were completely boiling wherever the sword light passed. Li Tianlan was like a comet shining in the whole dark world, rising against the sky above the sea. The bright sword light suddenly drew a stunning arc in the night. The comet skimmed over the sea, and its landing point was evil, which was hiding in the void. The heavy snow was blowing in the air. It was pure white. This chapter should have been published before 12 o'clock. I got stuck yesterday and didn't finish it. Today I went to another place, and there was a traffic jam on the way, so I published it 20 minutes late. Let's count it as yesterday. Every time I got stuck, I would tell everyone in the reader group about the problems that I couldn't solve. Those who didn't join the group, please join the group. If you really don't want to talk, you can block it. There are not many rules. It's not good to ask for leave in the VIP chapter now. If it's related to the work, basically no one can see it. So I didn't send it. If I ask for leave in the future, I will send it in related to the work. Chapter 258. The Strongest Sword Move. The Last Sword Move. The blazing white sword light crossed the sea, bringing amazing surging waves. The brilliant sword light, which was hundreds of meters long, was spreading with an unstoppable momentum. The sky and the sea seemed to be compressed, and the surging sword light crazily advanced between the sky and the sea. There was no word to describe the magnificence of this sword move. Wherever the sword intent passed, the vast sea rolled up hundreds of meters high waves. The starry sky trembled and surrendered to the sword light. The sea was rising, and the sky was lowering. In a trance, the sky and the sea seemed to be one. The sword light, like a comet, with dazzling sharpness, split the sky and the sea and rushed into the void. It was an irresistible and sublime sword move. The sword light exploded in the void where light should not exist. Snow was falling from the sky, and a large part of the night sky was illuminated as bright as day. Evil, who had been hiding in the dark, had nowhere to hide under the sword light. Li Tianlan saw evil. He saw the anger, consternation, and panic in his eyes. It was like the legend of Qin firing. The timing of this sword move was also subtle. What the murderous weapon blasted out was the power of the weapon itself, but it also consumed a lot of physical strength of the holder. The legend of Qin hadn't fallen yet, and evil's physical strength hadn't been completely replenished. Just when Li Tianlan killed Aldak, the 9th person on the divine list, with one sword move, evil breathed a sigh of relief. Li Tianlan's sword moved across the sea and came directly to him. The world and the void were completely broken into bubbles under the sharpness of the sword light. Li Tianlan's figure became more real than ever. At this moment, evil felt a great sense of danger. Without any hesitation, evil roared with all his strength. The domain of an invincible realm expert spread in the air desperately. The domain was trying its best to shrink. Evil's mouth began to bleed, and the expanding domain turned into a nearly transparent light shield in the blink of an eye. The light shield completely enveloped Evil's body. The flying snow fell after the sword light. Li Tianlan bore most of the remaining sword intent left by Wang Tianzong and God. Tianhai Wuji and Lu Shengzangquan finally got rid of the remaining sword intent. They saw the sword move that seemed to split the sky and sea. They also saw Evil's movement. Tianhai Wuji sighed softly and shook his head subconsciously. At the most crucial moment, Evil was actually defending. He was a killer and the only invincible realm killer in the dark world. At the critical moment of life and death, the assassin was defending. How ridiculous was that? Wang Tianzong was also looking at the sword light in the air. There was no need to think about what would happen to Evil, so he kept looking at Li Tianlan. The shining sword light that had completely dispelled the darkness split open the sky and sea, traversing the universe. The whole world, including the sword light, seemed a little fake. What is false is the whole world. Li Tianlan stood outside the world. He broke through again. Wang Tianzong whispered to himself. His tone was not dignified. Instead, he felt very comfortable. He is indeed a genius. What a pity. He retracted his gaze and said in a calm tone. Master, Di Jiang stood beside Wang Tianzong, wanting to say something but stopping on second thought. Don't talk about him. What can a dying man do no matter how strong he is? Wang Tianzong looked far away. In his sight, the heaven punishment troop of the Wang family of Beihai began to go away. They would board at the nearest dock and return to Beihai province. Blood flowed down the corners of Wang Tianzong's mouth. Wang Tianzong wiped it silently, expressionless. Master. Looking at the blood in Wang Tianzong's hand, Di Jiang's expression changed dramatically. It's okay. Wang Tianzong shook his head and took a last look. The light and shadow on the sea were still shining like the morning sun in the night sky. But for him, everything was over. Let's go back. Wang Tianzong turned around and said in a calm tone. But Di Jiang didn't want to give up. It's okay. Wang Tianzong said slowly, "What happened in East Island is just a beginning, just a beginning. There's no need to waste too much energy here. What's wrong with giving East Island to them for the time being?" Under the night sky, he took another look at the sword light in the sky like the scorching sun, then turned around and never looked back. Deity was also looking at the sword light. The sword light almost flew up against the sea level. Flying snow, huge waves, starry sky, bright moon, after the battle between him and Wang Tianzong, all the magnificence was in this sword. The sword momentum rose in the darkness. Wherever it passed, it was full of light, as if it was eternal. Drops of blood seeped out of Deity's black cloak, flowed down along his clothes, and finally condensed into a puddle in front of him. Deity didn't move, looking at Li Tianlan in the sky. His eyes were unwilling and amazed, but all the emotions eventually turned into indifference, with undisguised killing intent. In the void, the woman in white, who had never shown up and seemed to be a bystander, was also looking at the sword light. The sword light was as bright as day in the deep night sky, and the boundless sword intent was completely boiling. But in her eyes, it was so dim. The red crystal clear mutual forgetfulness swayed gently around her waist. In the silence, she seemed to take a step forward. This sword move was watched by all. East Island, Zhongzhou State, the 5 superpowers, all the elites were looking up silently. The sword intent was too proud and dazzling, so strong that it filled their sight and perception, and it couldn't be ignored. The Battle of Changdao was over. This was the last sword move. Maybe it had nothing to do with the final result, but it was related to the current general trend. In the camp of Sai City, Tribulation opened his eyes, and his breath was weak. Dongcheng Rushi's eyes sparkled. Confusion and clarity kept alternating, and she looked more and more beautiful. Yu Qingyan held Ning Qianxing beside her with her tender and white hands. She looked at the sword light in the sky, and occasionally at Phoenix, the master of the life-prolonging temple in red. The Yin and Yang sword master of Mount Shu, Han Chongyang, and the great void sword master, Li Beidian, frowned. They could feel the sharp sword will in the air that seemed to be able to shatter the sky, but they could also feel the emptiness and weakness behind the sword will. Second's senior brother, Han Chongyang, smiled bitterly and murmured to himself. The Wang family of Beihai was silent. Kunlun City was silent. East Island, the 5 superpowers, Tianhai Wuji, Lusheng Zhangquan, and everyone else was silent. In the weird silence, Qin Weibai's eyes were still ethereal and dreamy. She looked at Li Tianlan in the sky and stepped forward. She was alone. Until then, people found that Saint, who had been guarding her, had disappeared. But no one dared to attack her. Wherever Qin Weibai passed, the crowd automatically made way for her, whether it was Zhongzhou State or East Island. Because the sword light in the sky was still bright. She was still under the light of the heavenly sun of the present age. In front of evil, the invincible domain that had completely turned into the void shrank completely. The light shield expanded around him, light and heavy. This was a move without any killing intent. At this moment, all of evil's unique skills became the most thorough defense. As long as he could survive this sword strike. He thought silently, and his eyes became ferocious again. Divine punishment stabbed the light shield in front of evil with the sky-piercing sword light. A spot on the light shield suddenly caved in crazily, but it didn't break. Divine punishment paused slightly. Evil felt his blood run cold in an instant. In his sight, Li Tianlan's eyes were very calm. Evil saw determination in his eyes, determination that he didn't care about being smashed to pieces and being doomed eternally. Evil suddenly thought of Li Tianlan's ridiculous oath. He swore to mountain and sea. At this time, he completely understood that Li Tianlan came from Zhongzhou State. He saved the remaining team of Zhongzhou State alone and turned the tide. But the one he wanted to kill most was him and the Jiang family of South America. The sword light suddenly lit up. Li Tianlan's long sword stabbed straight in. All the rebound power on the light shield poured out wildly. Li Tianlan didn't care. It seemed that even if the world was broken, he had to stab with this sword. Boom! A deafening loud noise suddenly sounded on the sea. The huge waves that soared to the sky were completely shattered under the sharp and determined sword intent. The mountain-like waves turned into a large expanse of water light, as if the whole sea had completely exploded in the air. The sword light and the moonlight fell at the same time. The water in the void surged, the sparkling waves were dissipating, and finally became snowflakes. The heavy snow was flying. The snowflakes fell on the mountains, on the sea, and into the sword light. The sword light and the flying snow drifted away at the same time. The light shield around evil collapsed completely. The scarlet divine punishment sword edge directly stabbed into his mouth, pierced the back of his head, and came out from the other side of his head. The sword light, the void, and the huge waves all disappeared. Only the flying snow was still falling. Li Tianlan smashed evil's body with one sword. While countless pieces of flesh and bones were scattered in the sea, he reached out and grabbed the legend of Qin, which was famous in the dark world. The body of the legend of Qin trembled violently in his hand, but it didn't resist at all. A cyan bronze mirror hung at the end of the handle, constantly swaying in the air. He held a murderous weapon and a famous sword. Li Tianlan's aura was still strong, but after doing all this, he seemed to become completely weak in an instant. Tianhai Wuji and Wuxia and Xianxia stood in the distance, motionless. The snowflakes fell, and the midsummer night became cold. A large area of the battlefield was already a vast expanse of white. Li Tianlan fell silent. Everyone also fell silent. Only the cold wind whistled between heaven and earth. Only the ice and snow covered the mountains and fields. The snow was getting heavier and heavier, covering the whole mountain area. The night became no longer pure. Under the starlight, Li Tianlan crossed the sea in one step and appeared in the center of the battlefield. In the last afterglow of his life, he was a little tired, but he didn't despair. He stood high in the sky, pulled out his sword and looked around. In his sight, the corpses piled up like a mountain, and the blood flowed like a river. In the silence, Li Tianlan's voice rang out on the battlefield, clear like thunder, reverberating between heaven and earth, and the mountains began to roar under his voice. "Who dares to fight with me?" There was silence. No one spoke. Including Tianhai Wuji and Wuxia and Xianxia, two experts of the invincible realm. Li Tianlan laughed wildly and brilliantly. "Who is qualified to fight with me?" He stood in the void, and the snowflakes shuttled and fell around him. The fierce killing sword intent swept through the sky and the earth. His eyes began to become crazy, and his whole person seemed to have been connected with heaven and earth, extremely terrible. If I moved, the mountains and rivers would collapse. If I died, the sky and earth would collapse. Supreme and supreme. Wuxia and Xianxia and Tianhai Wuji were expressionless. The snow was still falling. Cold snow, cold people. Qin Weibai looked up quietly, almost devoutly at Li Tianlan in the air. She was motionless and looked a little obedient. Everything seemed to be going backward. The sharp sword intent passed through the quiet years, and a vast expanse of whiteness, like the snow, overlapped with this place, and heaven and earth were fading. In a trance, Qin Weibai seemed to see the same person, the same sword. But after all, there were too many people and things missing in this scene. There was no heavenly Emperor Huawu in her memory, no murderous weapon that was famous in the dark world, and no resolute black clothes that held the sword. She saw Li Tianlan raise the blade in his hand, and he smiled brightly. "I have a sword and I'm willing to go with you." Li Tianlan looked at the crowd of East Island, at the two experts of the invincible realm, and said calmly. The blade stretched in the air. The snowflakes dissipated. The sword light bloomed. There was only one sword between heaven and earth. The space around them fluctuated slightly without anyone noticing. A large expanse of starlight completely collapsed in an instant. Li Tianlan raised the blade in his hand, but the crazy and resolute sword intent suddenly appeared behind him. In the void that no one noticed, the sword intent bloomed. There seemed to be a waterfall that was completely condensed by sword intent in the air. The sword intent flew down, moving forward with indomitable will. The frenzied and extremely sharp sword intent instantly condensed into a single point. Li Tianlan turned around. A white dress abruptly appeared in Li Tianlan's sight. The combination of human and sword. The cold wind blew through the white dress. Her skirt corner, her veil, and the red dagger hanging on her waist kept dancing in the night wind, but her eyes were still fixed like ice and snow. Li Tianlan recognized this sword stroke. This sword stroke was the 11th blade. The 11th blade, alluring. Seemingly confused, Li Tianlan turned his head slightly. The blade of divine punishment was raised. At the same time, in the mountain area far away from this sword stroke, deity in black stared at the sword light in the air, staring at the white shadow. The white shadow moved forward in the cold wind, like a meteor, with a brilliance that stunned an era. Deity's body began to tremble. He held the huge death scythe in his hand tightly. His eyes were a little cold, a little self-deprecating, a little sad, and a little resentful. At the moment when the sword light lit up, deity, who dared to fight with Wang Tianzong, seemed to be laughing, but also seemed to be sighing helplessly. All the killing intent and indifference on his body disappeared completely, and his body began to stagger. But his hands were holding the weapon in his hand tightly. Deity staggered and took a step forward. His whole body directly rushed into the sky. The sword light traveled through the air. The extremely contracted sword light was bright and dazzling, with indescribable desolation and beauty. The blade in Li Tianlan's hand stopped. Everything seemed to be very short, but also seemed to be very long. Like an instant, like an eternity. Suddenly, the sword energy dissipated, and the sword intent dissipated. The white dress appeared in front of Li Tianlan. The long sword also appeared in front of Li Tianlan. The cold sword blade directly pierced Li Tianlan's heart. The surging sword intent broke out in his body and then came out. Countless blood mists burst out all over his body. Li Tianlan stood motionless, looking at the pair of cold starry eyes in front of him, and smiled slightly. From the moment he saw Qin Weibai, he knew that he would die today. But when death really came, he really experienced that feeling. Cold, desperate, like the feeling of the sword blade. Li Tianlan's smile gradually widened, and he whispered, "It hurts. Why don't you fight back?" She was dressed in white and her tone was cold. Her sword was shaking, and she seemed to be unable to control her emotions. "She will die." Li Tianlan smiled softly, but his eyes swept over the white dress in front of him and looked behind her. Behind him, Qin Weibai was standing there, watching everything that happened with gloomy eyes. The sword light lit up behind Li Tianlan. Qin Weibai was standing between Li Tianlan and the woman in white. In this position, if Li Tianlan fought back, the ultimate sword intent was enough to erase everything, including the elite team of Zhongzhou State, including Qin Weibai. Li Tianlan stopped the sword and used his body to bear all the sword intent of the opponent. The woman in white did not look back. She knew who Li Tianlan was looking at. Her arms kept shaking, but her tone was still calm. "I'm sorry. In this life, after all," she said sorry to the second person for the second time. Li Tianlan continued to smile. He did not look at the person in front of him, did not look at the sword in front of him, just looked at Qin Weibai, who was gradually blurring in his sight. People were dying, and their sight gradually began to become dark. "I'm sorry." The woman in white continued to speak. Li Tianlan tried to look. The two of them were very close, but they seemed to be far apart. "I want to go home." Li Tianlan looked at Qin Weibai and whispered to himself. The distance between them became the horizon, and his sight disappeared completely. There was only darkness in front of Li Tianlan, like a dead void. "I'm sorry." The voice of the woman in white continued to ring. Li Tianlan's eyes had lost focus. He tried to smile, kept the corners of his mouth stiffly, and looked in the direction of Qin Weibai. "I really want to see her again. I'm sorry." The long sword in her slender hand loosened. Li Tianlan's body fell down powerlessly. The ground was white, full of wind and snow. Saint's figure suddenly appeared in the air. He caught Li Tianlan and sent him to Qin Weibai's side. Qin Weibai took him. She looked calm, but her hands were a little weak. The moment she caught Li Tianlan, Their bodies fell directly in the snow. One figure after another appeared around Qin Weibai. The 12 super masters of Samsara Palace all appeared on the battlefield. With Saint as the leader, the 12 of them stood in a strange formation. However, the aura they emitted instantly merged into one, like a magnificent sword formation. Qin Weibai held Li Tianlan, who was covered in blood, tightly. For a moment, she seemed to be unable to speak at all. The delicate fragrance drilled into Li Tianlan's nostrils. Li Tianlan's face had turned blue and gray. He leaned against Qin Weibai's arms, and the stiff corners of his mouth moved hard. He trembled and said, "It hurts." In fact, it was not pain. It was because he was reluctant to leave. The cruelest emotion when a person was about to die was reluctance to leave. Qin Weibai bit her lip hard, lowered her head, and put her face on Li Tianlan's head, as if she wanted to give him some warmth. She bit her lips so hard that it bled, but she kept repeating it. "It's okay, it's okay." Li Tianlan smiled weakly. He seemed to want to reach out and touch Qin Weibai, but his raised hand was completely stiff, and finally fell to the ground without the slightest strength. He lay in Qin Weibai's arms, and there was no more sound. Everyone in Zhongzhou State subconsciously wanted to gather around, including the Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City. "Let them go!" Qin Weibai held Li Tianlan tightly and screamed all of a sudden. Everyone's footsteps suddenly stopped. Almost at the same second as Li Tianlan fell. Zhongzhou State, West Lake, Mount Qingyan. The fairyland, which had been crazily discussed by the people of Zhongzhou State on the internet recently, suddenly exploded in the middle of the night. Great Master Wei sat in the flowers and plants in front of Qingyun Temple, which almost submerged the temple gate. He held a fate roulette in his arms. On the roulette, the pointer representing the destiny of heaven had stopped trembling, and it steadily stayed on the word death. At a certain moment, the pointer on the roulette trembled slightly. The white mist that enveloped the entire Qingyun temple began to spin wildly in an instant. The white mist fluctuated and kept spinning over the entire Mount Qingyun. The wind blew through the mountains. The flowers, plants, and trees rustled. The cold wind passed all the way. In an instant, all the flowers, plants, and trees in the entire Qingyun temple withered in an instant. The entire Qingyun temple was completely quiet, as if the world was about to die. Great Master Wei, who sat cross-legged in front of the temple gate like a Buddha statue, slowly opened his eyes. He looked at the withered and fallen trees and flowers in his sight and breathed a sigh of relief. The pointer of the roulette in his hand no longer trembled, and it calmly stayed on the word death. Great Master Wei sighed softly. He reached out his hand. A gust of wind suddenly blew through the air. The gust of wind blew his monk robe. White hair had already grown out of his bald head, reaching his waist. It suddenly exploded in the gust of wind and flew wildly. Great Master Wu's palms stayed on the pointer. Little by little, it seemed that he had exhausted all his strength. His palm pushed the pointer back to the center of the word life on the roulette. The white mist all over the sky fell desperately. Great Master Wu looked up at the sky. As the wind blew, his face was full of wrinkles, and he seemed to be struggling to open his eyes. Blood flowed down from between his eyebrows. It dripped to the ground. Great Master Wu opened his mouth slowly. His voice was weak, as if he was praising himself, but also as if he was telling a fact. He said softly, "I've done immeasurable good in my life." The white mist all over the sky trembled at the same time, and the white mist that had pervaded Mount Qingyun for many days disappeared completely in an instant. The night sky was clear, and the stars were bright. Great Master Wu's blood fell into the soil on the ground. Flowers bloomed in the soil. The color was soft, and there was only one. Chang'e. Everything seemed to have come to an end. In the air, the woman in white, who seemed to have calmed down, took a deep look at Qin Weibai and Li Tianlan, who were hugging each other. She turned around silently, as if she wanted to leave. "Where do you want to go?" A gentle voice that made people feel as if they were bathing in the spring breeze rang in her ears. Deity's figure appeared in front of the woman in white, and his eyes were soft. But the woman in white saw extreme cruelty and mockery in his soft eyes. This was a look she was familiar with. She just saw the fight between Deity and Wang Tianzong, but she didn't see his eyes. You, the woman in white's body suddenly shook violently. She trembled violently in the air and stared at Deity in front of her. Her eyes fluctuated violently, with surprise and panic. "Do you know me?" Deity chuckled and said, "How do you know me?" He reached out and pointed to his heart. Under the white veil, the woman in white's face suddenly turned pale, and even her eyes were full of despair. She naturally knew what this action meant. Many years ago, just like today, in the heavy snow, she also pierced the heart of the man in front of her with a sword. It was the exact same sword. The woman in white's lips kept trembling. She looked at Deity in front of her with guilt and panic in her eyes. Do you deserve to talk to me?" Deity suddenly spoke in a soft and cold tone. "Who do you think you are? Do you deserve to talk to me? Just listen to what I say." "No," the woman in white's body shook and seemed to fall from the air. Crystal clear tears fell from her eyes and fell on the white snow on the ground. Her voice was hoarse, desperate, and empty. "Please don't do this." "Do what?" Deity was still smiling. "It's not me. It's you. Don't do this to me." The woman in white's body kept trembling. She began to step back like a delicate and weak flower. "You deserve this, don't you? It's not too much to treat a person like you, right?" Deity laughed and said, "Hypocritical, insidious, and slutty. Should I call you a vicious woman? Or should I call you a whore?" No. The woman in white finally cried. Her voice was intermittent, without any coherence. "I once thought about it. I really thought about it. I wanted to stay with you for the rest of my life." "Stay with you?" Deity laughed out loud. "For you and me, the cruelest thing in the world is to stay with you. You don't deserve this word." His voice was low. "You used to be very good to me and I was moved. But the more I was moved and the more I doted on you, the more I hated you when I learned the truth." He looked at the woman in white's eyes. "You can't make up for anything. No matter how good you are to me, you can't make up for anything. Only you will die, so—" Deity raised the death scythe in his hand. "Go to hell, bitch." In the sky, the woman in white's figure suddenly shook. On the ground, Qin Weibai, who was holding Li Tianlan, also shook. In the sky and on the ground, the two women in white had despair in their eyes. The death scythe was raised. The sharp blade appeared in front of the woman in white in an instant. The woman in white did not dodge. She just looked at the man in front of her quietly, with tears streaming down her face. The death scythe stopped in front of the woman. Deity tilted his head and smiled with some playfulness. "You seem to be in pain?" He held the death scythe firmly in his hand. "Well, it seems good to let you suffer for a while." The huge and cold blade gently patted the woman's face, but did not remove her veil. He was tired of seeing this face. Even if it was beautiful, it was still vicious. "Get out," he said. "Live a little longer. When I'm tired of playing, I'll take your cheap life. Get out." The woman in white laughed self-mockingly and said softly, "Kill me." "Dirty hands." Deity's tone was full of disgust. The woman in white seemed to calm down. She looked at Deity in front of her and whispered, "I told you a long time ago that I'm all yours. I killed you once. When you need me to die, come to me. I'll solve it myself." She turned around and said softly, "As long as you're happy." Deity did not say anything. The woman in white turned around and left. Her figure passed through the sword intent left by Deity and appeared in front of everyone again. Although the conversation between the two of them was very long, there were only a few people who could hear and see it. Very few. Deity's figure landed on the ground. The woman in white disappeared in the distance. Everything came to an end. The fierce man who suddenly appeared but could take Wang Tianzong's 6 paths of reincarnation slowly walked to Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai. The 12 super masters were motionless. What a fool! Deity looked at Li Tianlan, who fell into Li Tianlan's arms without a sound. There were obvious emotional fluctuations in his voice. He seemed to be laughing and crying at the same time. He looked at Li Tianlan as if he was looking at himself a long time ago. Qin Weibai, whose eyes were desperate and numb, raised her head stiffly. She looked at Deity. Her ethereal and dreamy eyes finally had some spirit. He looked at her and stared at her. "You can save him," Qin Weibai said word by word. Deity did not speak. Qin Weibai picked up divine punishment in Li Tianlan's hand with trembling hands. The scarlet sword blade was raised in her hand. She pointed at Deity. Her posture of holding the sword was a little jerky, but her posture was extremely firm. "Save him. What are you willing to pay for him?" Deity's tone was calm. "Everything." Qin Weibai did not hesitate. Everything. This word was too heavy, especially for a person of high status like Qin Weibai. How could she say it lightly? Deity's eyes gradually softened. "I will do it," he said, "with everything you have." "What do you want?" Qin Weibai's tone was cold. Although she had given a lot before, the initiative was in the hands of Deity. It was as if she had expected all this before. But now Li Tianlan was in her arms without breathing or heartbeat, which was also unbearable for her. "I don't want anything. We just need to continue to cooperate." Deity waved his hand. The legend of Qin in Li Tianlan's hands suddenly trembled. The cyan bronze mirror hanging on the handle of the spear directly left the body of the spear and flew into Deity's hand. "Yada no Kagami." Deity looked at the mirror in front of him with calm eyes. One of the national divine weapons of East Island can appear in the hands of evil. He turned to look at the elite team of East Island. It seems that there is a deal between the Jiang family of South America and East Island. Deity knocked on the cyan bronze mirror casually and said calmly, "This thing is very useful. I'll leave everything to you." Qin Weibai looked at Deity, and her tone was a little pleading. "I don't have absolute confidence," Deity said. "At most, I have 70% confidence. Give him to me." "It's 80%. Qin Weibai subconsciously held Li Tianlan in her arms. "Saint will go with you." Deity looked at Saint with some surprise. Saint was also looking at him calmly. "Is it worth it?" Deity asked with some playfulness. Saint's answer was simple and domineering. "I do." Once the identity of some people was clear, they were old acquaintances. Deity laughed and waved his hand. Dawn, the master of the Athanasia temple, appeared in front of everyone. He was no longer in white, but in black, exactly the same as the members of the Athanasia temple behind him. "How is Daybreak?" Deity asked softly. "Fortunately, he's just temporarily unconscious. It's not a big problem," Dawn said in a respectful tone. Deity nodded and looked at Li Tianlan with a flash of killing intent in his eyes. Then he shook his head. "Take him back. This person needs to be saved," Dawn answered and was about to step forward. Qin Weibai held Li Tianlan tightly and looked down at him quietly. Li Tianlan closed his eyes, so he couldn't hear or see. Qin Weibai looked at his face deeply as if she wanted to carve him into her soul. Her palms were trembling. She held Li Tianlan and got closer and closer. "Boss Qin." Dawn stood in front of Qin Weibai and shrugged helplessly. Qin Weibai silently handed Li Tianlan to Dawn. The process was very short, but every second was as long as thousands of years. She closed her eyes and her hands became empty. It was not until a long time after Dawn took Li Tianlan away that Qin Weibai opened her eyes and trembled with breath. The battlefield was still the same. Everyone was clearly standing in different places. The only difference was that there was no Li Tianlan on the battlefield. But for Qin Weibai, the only difference was the biggest difference. She slowly stood up and left the battlefield step by step. "Don't you go and have a look?" Deity's voice sounded behind her. Qin Weibai didn't stop and kept moving forward. At this moment, Qin Weibai was still beautiful, but she seemed to have lost all her soul. Her figure became numb and powerless. Everything ended here. Zhongzhou State. Li Tianlan. That place, that man, carried too much of her sorrow and joy. She had long been overwhelmed. So she didn't look back, and she would never set foot in Zhongzhou State for the rest of her life. Qin Weibai's eyes were empty and silent. It was a kind of despair. Her soul, her feelings, her home. She was buried under the starlight tonight. Blood flowed down the corners of her mouth and dyed her white clothes red bit by bit. Chapter 259. Deity quietly watched Qin Weibai's figure disappear, but he didn't see her fall down. Except for saint and military counselor, the super masters of samsara left one after another. The battle stopped, and the sea became calm again. Bright starlight sprinkled down. On the battlefield that had completely ended, everything was calm like a silent picture. God stood where he was, motionless. The others didn't dare to move either. The elites of Zhongzhou state who had suffered heavy losses stood in the center of the battlefield. The remaining team of less than 200 people was almost all seriously injured. Gong Sun Qi, the Azure Dragon of Zhongzhou state, stood in front of the crowd with Tribulation's help. He looked at Deity, who seemed to be thinking about something, with a calm expression. Tribulation's expression was also calm. No one took the initiative to attack Zhongzhou state. The elites of East Island and even the elites of the 5 superpowers had separated quietly at some point. All the elites of the Jiang family of South America had been wiped out. The Heroes Club, the Polar Ground Alliance, the Fantasy World and Knights Templars, who had lost their leaders, still had a vague connection with each other, but their vigilance toward each other was greater than cooperation. Tianhai Wuji and Lusheng Zhangquan stood in front of the elites of East Island and didn't say anything. The battle was meaningless. In the final battle of Changdao, all the superpowers sent out their elites frequently, and the flames of war spread to the entire dark world. No matter which side, they all spent a lot of effort, but they all suffered heavy losses, and the final winner didn't belong to any side. The Purgatory of Heaven Capital, which suddenly appeared, broke the plan of all superpowers and became the biggest beneficiary of this final battle. Before the Purgatory of Heaven Capital, or Deity, showed a clear attitude, any action of any other superpower was meaningless. Deity had no attitude. He just stood there quietly in the starry sky, as if he had fallen asleep. Time passed slowly. From night to late night. The bloody smell in the battlefield was getting heavier and heavier, and the atmosphere was constantly depressed in the silence. Everyone's body seemed to be numb from standing, but the anxiety in their hearts kept rising and falling. Then, a phone suddenly rang, breaking the extreme silence on the battlefield. At the front of the East Island camp, Crown Prince Renhe of the royal family answered the phone with a serious look. After saying something respectfully, he started to move forward. Countless people focused their attention on Crown Prince Renhe. Crown Prince Renhe walked toward Deity. His back was straight, but the closer he got to Deity, the more bent his back became. The distance between them shortened. Crown Prince Renhe's body finally bent into a humble posture. Renhe greets your highness. He walked in front of God and bowed deeply. Crown Prince, you're too polite. Deity glanced at him and said in a calm tone. Father has asked me to invite your highness for breakfast. The helicopter is already on its way. Imperial Father will be waiting for you in the palace. Crown Prince Renhe's tone became even more respectful. He did not deliberately conceal his voice, so everyone who should have heard it heard it. This was not a surprising choice. East Island suffered a heavy loss in this battle. At least 10 superiors of the half-step invincible realm died in Li Tianlan's hands. Shinichi Miyamoto, the palace master of Liuhua Palace, died. A large number of superiors at the peak of the Thundershocking realm disappeared, and countless elites of the Fire-Flaming realm were lost. After this battle, the strength of the special warfare system of East Island was weakened by half. More importantly, even the other half of their strength was basically controlled by God. Tianhai Wuji, Lusheng Zhangquan, and a large number of elites of the Divine Wind Force were on the battlefield right now. Deity was also here. Even if he could not kill everyone here, it was easy for him to inflict heavy damage on the remaining strength of East Island. East Island would understand the situation in front of them. So Deity's silence before was equivalent to forcing East Island to make a clear statement. Crown Prince Renhe's open invitation was also equal to East Island's attitude to the whole dark world. Whether it was forced or sincerely welcomed, after the Battle of Changdao, East Island had recognized the Purgatory of Heaven Capital. This was the best choice. If the purgatory of heaven capital didn't appear, the whole East Island would not have the strength to stop the outbreak of Li Tianlan and the attack of the Wang family of Beihai. At that time, the whole special warfare system of East Island would fall, and the royal family would be forced to give up everything under the huge pressure. The whole special warfare system would fall into the hands of Zhongzhou state and the Wang family of Beihai. Without this sharp blade in the dark world, all the future development of East Island would be greatly constrained. The purgatory of heaven capital forced the Wang family of Beihai to retreat. To some extent, it saved East Island. At least Tianhai Wuji and Lu Shengzangquan, two superiors of the invincible realm, were still there. They were still the special warfare force controlled by the royal family. And the most noteworthy thing was the purgatory of heaven capital itself. They were different from the complicated beliefs and stances behind the 5 superpowers, which were supported by financial groups, politics, or religions. They were also different from Zhongzhou state. The purgatory of heaven capital had no stance. They only did everything for themselves. This was very similar to the Samsara Palace, and it was the easiest for East Island to accept when there was no other choice. For East Island, the purgatory of heaven capital had no stance, which meant that it had the possibility of being assimilated. On the premise of retaining part of its own strength, the purgatory of heaven capital could take the lead of the special warfare system of East Island and help them build a foundation in East Island. In a short time, even if the purgatory of heaven capital wouldn't help East Island risk its life, at least because they had no stance, they wouldn't go against East Island without hurting their interests. That was enough. And in the future, when they completely accepted the purgatory of heaven capital, and deity was willing to fight for East Island, that would be the best result. East Island chose the purgatory of heaven capital, which had no stance. Imperceptibly, it actually gave the purgatory of heaven capital a stance. The key was to see what they would do in the future. But no matter what, after tonight, East Island had the possibility to keep a super superior who was strong enough to rival Wang Tianzong in East Island. That was the most important thing. Deity looked at Crown Prince Renhe in silence and didn't speak for a long time. Cold sweat dripped down from Crown Prince Renhe's forehead. He was the Crown Prince of East Island with a high position and power. But under absolute force, he was also a non-entity. Crown Prince Renhe's body bent more and more, as if he wanted to kneel on the ground under Deity's feet. Deity's eyes turned and fell on Tianhai Wuji and Lu Shengzangquan. His eyes were gentle, but the two invincible realm saber and sword grandmasters felt the inviolable majesty at the same time. They looked at each other, bowed at the same time, and said in a dry voice, "Your Highness." "Ha," Deity chuckled. He hadn't gone to Dongdu Imperial Palace yet, but he issued the first order. "Prepare 5 boats." Crown Prince Renhe responded subconsciously, and then he froze. Out of instinct, he looked at the battlefield. Zhongzhou State, Fantasy World, Knights Templars, the Polar Ground Alliance, and the Heroes Club. There were exactly 5 families. No one in the Jiang family of South America survived. Sure enough, Deity waved his hand and said blandly, "Tell them to get out." Crown Prince Renhe wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Finally, he bowed and left. From the standpoint of East Island at this time, with the purgatory of heaven capital, it was in the best interest of East Island for them to keep all the forces here. But the first order of God could not be violated in any case, and no one dared to violate it. He made a phone call and withdrew all the troops on the edge of the battlefield. Then he looked at the 5 superpowers, including Zhongzhou State. "Everyone please." The Polar Ground Alliance was the first to turn around and retreat to the north coast, waiting for their boats. "Send a message back to your master for me." In the stiff formation of the superpowers, Deity's unhurried voice rang out. "You, as well as the other superpowers in the Dark World, get out of Heaven Capital and East Island with me within 12 hours. Otherwise, don't blame me for being impolite." The superpowers left one after another. Whether they were willing or not, they had failed in this battle of Changdao. A crushing defeat. The roar of the helicopter's rotor came from afar. Deity turned around and looked. In the northernmost area, the people of the Polar Ground Alliance had started to board. Deity walked to the helicopter that was gradually landing. All the people of East Island followed Deity. The people of Sanluo Hall and Athanasia Hall started to leave the battlefield. Phoenix in a fiery red dress turned around and looked at the members of the Hall of Longevity behind her. As she glanced around, many members of the Hall of Longevity showed an unnatural expression. The tacit understanding of the Hall of Longevity was still there, but they seemed a little strange to her, the Hall Master. Phoenix waved her hand. The Hall of Longevity also started to retreat. Only Saint and Military Counselor were left on the battlefield. Saint looked at the people of the Polar Ground Alliance boarding the ship. The killing intent flashed in his eyes, but he suppressed it in the end. "That's it," Saint said. Military Counselor's tone was a little solemn. "Boss, something was wrong just now." "Yeah." Saint was silent for a while and sighed softly. "We can't help her when it comes to love. Love was a matter between two people. Even if their hearts were dead, even if they were desperate, it had nothing to do with others." "What's your plan?" Military Counselor looked at the sea ahead and asked. Saint narrowed his eyes and said softly, "I'm going to stay in East Island for a while. At least, I have to solve the problem in Tianlan, and then discuss the next step of cooperation with the Purgatory of Heaven Capital." "What about you?" "You're really busy." Military Counselor laughed. On the battlefield where only the two of them were left, they talked to each other casually, as if they were really old friends. "Of course I'm going back to Zhongzhou State. I'm going to take a break for a while and take it as a long vacation." Saint smiled with some playfulness. "Take a break? How many people are most afraid of you taking a break? When you take a break, it's the real bloodbath, right?" Military Counselor smiled and didn't say anything. When he took a break, he was no longer the second Heaven King Military Counselor of Samsara. For some people, this was the most terrible thing. "About Tianlan, have you decided?" Military Counselor suddenly changed the topic and asked. Saint was silent. At this time, everyone was far away from the battlefield. In the starlight and the sea breeze, only the two of them in black were left. Saint took off his cloak, revealing a thin and determined face, with sword-like eyebrows and starry eyes, handsome and vicissitudes of life. "I can't refuse." Saint lit a cigarette for himself. "And it's just a temporary step back. It's nothing. I hope I can let Tianlan go further by taking a step back." It was just a step back. But this step was a step back from the top of the half-step invincible realm to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. Even if it was only temporary, it was still a big step for people like Saint who didn't have many opportunities. It was a big step. Military Counselor didn't say anything. A long time ago, the two of them had already known, whether in terms of life level or martial arts level, the extreme of samsara. It was nirvana. Chapter 260. When Deity got off the helicopter, it was late at night. In the darkest time before dawn, the imperial palace of Dongdu was quiet, and only the lights were shining. This breakfast was a little early. The imperial palace here was also a little small. Looking at Crown Prince Renhe who was leading the way, Deity thought silently. The two walked through the imperial palace in the middle of the night. Along the way, all the lights in the imperial palace were lit up, as if they were paying tribute. It was not a suitable time to visit, but the whole imperial family gave them the highest courtesy. The Mikado and the Empress walked out of the bedchamber and walked down the steps to welcome the new dominator of the East Island's special warfare system. No matter how they felt inside, they both smiled like a spring breeze. The Mikado was nearly 60 years old and he was short. After his handsome face got older, he gave people the impression of his demeanor and wisdom. The Empress was a little younger, but she was still beautiful. She stood beside the Mikado with a sweet smile, gentle and generous. Deity walked up to them. The Mikado took the initiative to speak. He looked at Deity in front of him with soft eyes and a soft tone. "Welcome, Your Highness. I asked the Empress to prepare breakfast in person, and I hope Your Highness will like it." The Mikado turned his head to welcome the guest with a warm smile. It was a kind of warmth without any emotion, very sincere, But the sincerity was like a mask with boundless calmness and calmness. I don't have much time. Deity shook his head. If the Mikado has something to say, just say it. I won't have breakfast. He called the Mikado, not His Majesty. Obviously, psychologically, Deity completely put his position on the same level as the Mikado. The royal family of East Island never seemed to have any real power, but for generations the royal family could give up everything, but they always firmly held the power of the special warfare system in their own hands. This result would inevitably change after the rise of the purgatory of Heaven Capital. The Mikado, who was mentally prepared, kept his smile and asked casually, "Your Highness, are you in a hurry?" To save him. Deity's tone was also calm. The Mikado nodded and said thoughtfully, "Li Tunlon? Can he still be saved?" 80%. Deity's tone was calm. But the atmosphere in front of the bedchamber suddenly became a little tense. "Your Highness, please." The Mikado was silent for a while, then he reached out his hand again and gestured for Deity to enter. He was still smiling, but his eyes were completely calm, with an irresistible temperament. Deity chuckled and walked straight into the bedchamber. The dining room of the bedchamber had prepared a full table of standard Japanese breakfast, but no one knew if it was cooked by the queen. God sat down and drank the sake without saying a word. Although Li Tianlan is young, he has terrible potential. If your Highness saves him, he may become a big problem for East Island in the future. Now that your Highness controls the special warfare system of East Island, you should think about East Island. I don't think it's appropriate to save this person. In the silent atmosphere, the Emperor looked at God and said seriously. Previously, they did not know each other. The reason they could sit together was because of the general trend. Thus, there was no need to be polite to each other. God wanted to get straight to the point, so the Emperor of Mikado went straight to the point. Li Tianlan is nothing to be afraid of. In the end, he is still too young. Deity played with the wine glass in his hand and said casually, "I know what you are worried about. But for some special reasons he had to live now. But he won't grow up. I saved him today, and when the time is right in the future, I will personally kill him." Special reason? Special reasons. Is it because of the cooperation with Samsara Palace? Deity's hand that was playing with the wine glass paused slightly. He raised his head and looked at the Mikado in front of him. "This is very important," he said in a calm tone. The Mikado nodded and said, "Oh, I have a favor to ask," Deity suddenly said. The Mikado ate a mouthful of sashimi, and a strange light flashed in his eyes. He said with a smile, "What do you want?" "Information." Deity's tone was still calm, and the black cloak covered his whole face. But at this moment, he gave the Mikado an extremely gloomy and cold feeling. "Within 7 days, I need to know which special people have been to Ninghu. All the people of the half-step invincible realm are special people. Huawu died in Ninghu. This was the most strange thing and the biggest accident for the purgatory of Heaven Capital. With Huawu's strength, no one of the half-step invincible realm could kill him. Even if he couldn't beat them, he could always escape. If it wasn't an invincible realm expert who took action in person, it could only mean that Huawu died in a siege. And it could only be caused by the siege of at least several half-step invincible realm experts. Deity was now the new master of the special warfare system of East Island, but there was still a gap between the name and the reality. In a short time, he couldn't really keep his word in East Island. But avenging his son had become Deity's obsession. This was the most important thing for him right now. "I can give you the information in 3 days." The Mikado said in a calm tone, "That's all you need. The dark world of East Island is all mine. What else can I ask for?" Deity shook his head in self-mockery. "I really want a son, but he's dead. He died in Ninghu a few days ago." The Mikado subconsciously tightened his body. Then he knew why Deity wanted that list. His old eyes looked at Crown Prince Runha, who stood respectfully at the dining table, and then looked at the Empress beside him. The Empress's charming and beautiful eyes looked complicated. The Mikado seemed to have made up his mind. He suddenly raised his voice and said, "Ziyi." The sound of light footsteps could be heard. Under the bright light in the bedchamber, a touch of heart-shaking purple footsteps walked into the dining room. The purple palace dress fluttered, and her black hair was like clouds. She was a stunning beauty of about 23 or 24 years old. She was tall and beautiful, but the most attractive thing about her was her temperament. It was as if she was born with a reserved and noble temperament, which was a dazzling color in the eyes of the opposite sex. "This is my daughter, Princess Ziyi." The Mikado looked at Deity with a serious look in his eyes. "Your Highness, I can give you whatever you want. You lost a son in Ninghu, and Ziyi can give you another one. From now on, my daughter is your woman." He looked at Deity and said word by word, "Your Highness, I'm willing to treat the Purgatory of Heaven Capital with the greatest sincerity. I hope the Purgatory of Heaven Capital won't betray me in the end." Princess Ziyi blushed, and her bright eyes peeked at Deity, who was completely wrapped in a black cloak. She bit her lip, and her expression was complicated. "What do you want?" Deity's tone was calm and calm. He waved to Princess Ziyi. The delicate and noble young woman came to him with some hidden bitterness. Deity stretched out his hand impudently and held Ziyi's young but noble body in his arms. He smelled the fragrance from her hair, felt the stiffness and softness of her body, and asked the Mikado, "My country is too small, and I can't do anything. I hope your Highness can help me." Looking at his daughter sitting on Deity's lap, the Mikado smiled happily. "I see." Deity nodded. "I know what you mean, and I will help you." The Mikado was overjoyed, and even lost his composure. He stood up, bowed deeply to Deity, and said solemnly, "Thank you, your Highness." Deity waved his hand, motioning Crown Prince Renhe and the Queen to leave. When their figures disappeared in the dining room, he coughed slightly and said, "But I need time." "About 2 years." He said calmly, "I need to heal my wounds." The Mikado was stunned, and his voice trembled. "You're injured? You're no match for Wang Tianzong? The first on the divine list. How could he have any match? But he's not much better. His injuries are just a little lighter than mine." Deity shook his head. "So even for your plan, the cooperation between the Purgatory of Heaven Capital and the Samsara Palace is extremely important." The Mikado was silent. After a long time, he nodded. "I see." Deity said. He suddenly reached out and pinched Ziyi's white and tender chin. Ziyi looked at Deity weakly and timidly, and her plump red lips trembled slightly. "Would you like to have a son for me?" Deity's tone was indifferent. Ziyi blushed. She was a noble princess, but she was still a young woman who had never been in contact with a man. She had to answer such a shameful question when she was hugged by a man for the first time. How could she say it? "Say it," Deity said with an indisputable tone. "I'd like to." Ziyi whispered like a mosquito. After saying this, she buried her face in Deity's arms as if she didn't dare to see anyone. The Mikado smiled and said nothing. Ziyi and the other princess were originally prepared for Li Tianlan. Now, it seemed much better to give them to Deity. Deity stood up and put his arms around Ziyi's waist. "If Ziyi and I have children, what will happen in the future?" Deity looked at the Mikado and asked. The Mikado's heart trembled, and he said subconsciously, "What do you want?" "Crown Prince." Deity's tone was arrogant and domineering. "If Ziyi and I have children, he must be the Crown Prince of East Island." The Mikado didn't respond. Deity held Ziyi and turned to the dining room. "If you fight with Wang Tianzong, what will happen?" The Mikado's voice sounded behind him. He was a little hesitant, as if he couldn't make up his mind. "If I die, he will be useless." Deity's tone was calm. "That's about it," he paused and continued, "but if I enter the invincible realm, it will be different." The Mikado's expression changed dramatically. He looked at Deity incredulously and trembled. "You're not in the invincible realm? If I'm not in the invincible realm, how can I have the face to say that I've entered the invincible realm?" Deity's tone was disdainful. "Like those good-for-nothings in your East Island? The invincible realm is the invincible realm of the invincible realm. In the whole dark world, Only Wang Tianzong deserves the title of Invincible Realm. Without saying more, he walked out of the bedchamber and out of the palace with Ziyi in his arms. The night of the seventh day began to fade away. There was a glimmer of light in the sky. Deity took Ziya's hand and walked down the steps in front of the palace. A fiery red dress crawled on the steps in the most pious and humble posture, facing Deity. Deity narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at the moving and tempting body curve in his sight. As far as he knew, only Phoenix liked to wear this color. But the woman in front of him was not Phoenix. "What's the matter?" Deity asked. "My Shiranui, the palace master of Yohua Palace, greets your highness." Mai Shiranui's body became more and more humble. Her delicate hands moved forward, holding up the token that represented the highest power of Liohua Palace. She didn't hide her intention of surrender at all. "Get up," Deity said. Mai Shiranui stood up hesitantly. Her hands still moved forward, and she handed over the token in her hand. Deity didn't take it. He said calmly, "Keep it?" Mai Shiranui's beautiful face looked stunned. "Let's go," Deity said and walked down the steps. Mai Shiranui, who looked surprised, followed Deity closely. She said in a trembling voice, "Thank you, your highness." In the black cloak, facing the dawn of the new day, Deity laughed. His eyes were calm, but he was laughing with his claws and teeth. There was a glimmer of light in the sky of East Island. The morning sun had risen on the border between Zhongzhou State and Annan State. The golden light shrouded the earth. The light passed through the dense forest and fell on the plain. The entire battlefield was a sea of blood. The battle was over. The living and the dead, the martyrs and the warriors gathered together. Heaven and earth were silent. The unidentified rebels and the elites of the 5 superpowers had disappeared without a trace. There were a lot of corpses on the ground, and those who were alive had already fled to the distance. Only the military flag of Zhongzhou State's Border Control Corps and the star flag of Zhongzhou State were flying on the battlefield at the same time, shining with bloody light in the morning sun. There were less than 5,000 people left in the Thunderbolt Battalion, the most elite of Zhongzhou State's Border Control Corps. But at this moment, everyone still stood neatly in a formation that could attack at any time. Even if there were no enemies in front of them. Dong Qingwudi, the Marshal of Zhongzhou State and the commander of the Border Control Corps, walked straight ahead on the silent battlefield, all the way south. The military flag of the Border Control Corps and the star flag of Zhongzhou State stood side by side in the southernmost position, whistling in the cold morning wind. An old figure appeared in the south and walked slowly over. In the morning wind, he was also holding a flagpole in his hand. On the flagpole, the star flag had been riddled with holes, but it kept breaking. The broken star flag danced in the air, looking more and more piercing. One figure after another came out from behind the old man holding the flagpole. The whole place was silent. Dong Qingwudi, who was standing under the flag of the army, suddenly felt hot in his eyes. He looked at the old man in his sight and the veterans behind him. A team of more than 100 people. This was the remaining Li family. They fought against the elites of the 5 superpowers and the Saint War Angel of the Vatican. After several days and nights of fierce fighting, there were less than 50 people left in the team of more than 100 people. But everyone's expression was calm. No regrets. Dong Qingwudi slowly raised his arm. Behind him, the commanders of the 4 armies, Wang Wandian, Shi Hanbing, Qing Huaining, and Xiao Dongzhan, raised their arms at the same time. Every soldier of the Thunderbolt Battalion also raised his arm. "Salute!" The old man holding the flag slowly returned the salute. He came to Dong Qingwudi. "I'm still old." Li Honghe smiled. "I didn't catch that little guy, and he ran away." Senior Li, Dong Qingwudi couldn't control his trembling voice at all. He took a deep breath and said in a trembling voice, "You've done enough. Please pay attention to your own health. It doesn't matter." Li Honghe shook his head. "I'm too tired. We're all too tired. From now on, the Li family will only live for the Li family. In any case, the Li family is a hero." Dong Qingwudi looked at Li Honghe and said in a firm tone. Li Honghe smiled. He was a hero. Throughout his life, he was worthy of this title. But what could a hero do? He looked up into the distance. In his sight, the beautiful mountains and rivers were covered with blood. A little tired, Li Honghe shook his head. I'm tired. He turned to look at the Li family's team of less than 50 people and whispered, let's go home. From Dongqing Wudi to the ordinary soldiers, everyone saluted at the same time and watched Li Honghe and others leave the battlefield. In the silence, Li Honghe's figure disappeared. Dongqing Wudi suddenly reached out, pulled out the army flag beside him, and shouted, where is this? Zhongzhou State, Zhongzhou State, Zhongzhou State. A tsunami of cheers suddenly sounded and swept through the world. Where was this? A few days ago, they broke through the border between Zhongzhou State and Annan State. Today, after fighting all the way, the Li family and the Border Control Corps had penetrated 800 miles into the territory of Annan State. But it didn't matter. Now this was Zhongzhou State. It could only be Zhongzhou State. The roar of the helicopter's rotors sounded in the sky. Two figures jumped down from the helicopter one after the other and landed on the ground. Wang Tianzong, Dijiang. Dongqing Wudi narrowed his eyes, hesitated, and walked toward them. Wang Tianzong quietly looked at the blood-stained battlefield in his sight, as if looking at his own country. Dongqing Wudi came over. Well done. Thank you for your hard work. Wang Tianzong turned his head and looked at Dongqing Wudi. I'm just keeping my promise. Thanks to Senior Li this time. Dongqing Wudi's tone was indifferent. Wang Tianzong was silent for a moment. Finally, he changed the topic and pointed to Dijiang beside him. From today on, he will be in charge of the new army. The Heaven Punishment Troop will also be stationed here temporarily. Dongqing Wudi nodded and turned a blind eye to Dijiang's outstretched hand. He just said blandly, I will replenish the Thunderbolt Battalion as soon as possible and complete the handover. He turned and left. From now on, the former Thunderbolt Battalion no longer existed. Dongqing Wudi would completely replenish the Thunderbolt Battalion to 20,000 people, and the 20,000 people with the most combat power among the hundreds of thousands of troops of the Border Control Corps, together with the 800 miles of land, would belong to the Wang family of Beihai. Dongqing Wudi might rebuild the Thunderbolt Battalion after the handover, but that Thunderbolt would not be the current Thunderbolt after all. The current Thunderbolt Battalion would stay here with Dijiang and play the role they should play. In the general trend, after the fight, everything was a deal. It was all about balance and compromise. The morning sun rose into the sky. Dark clouds floated over the sky. The golden sun was blocked. Li Honghe had gone far with the people of the Li family. Summer and autumn were alternating. Rain fell from the sky in the early morning. It was another rainstorm. Dongqing Wudi withdrew from the border. All the superpowers began to withdraw from Changdao. This seemed to be an era of constant withdrawal and turmoil. What Li Honghe said to Dongqing Wudi spread. After the final battle, the Li family, which had been silent for many years, began to live only for the Li family. The Li family began to really withdraw from Zhongzhou State and dissipated its afterglow. Time passed quickly. It also withdrew quickly. Samsara Palace began to withdraw from Zhongzhou State. Everyone thought that the cooperation between Samsara Palace and the Purgatory of Heaven Capital was a betrayal to Zhongzhou State, and it was true. But when everyone wanted to settle accounts with Samsara Palace, they found that there was nothing to find. They had no foundation in Zhongzhou State. The only foundation was Qin Weibai's Pre-Qin International Group. Pre-Qin International Group was acquired by all parties in the shortest time, and the whole group was renamed. In just a few days, Samsara Palace completely eliminated the last trace of itself in Zhongzhou State. All the details of the Battle of Changdao were publicized. Li Tianlan's name began to shine throughout the Dark World for the first time. A 19-year-old invincible realm expert. No matter how coincidental the result was, at least Li Tianlan did amaze the whole Dark World that night. The names of the 3 young heavenly sons of Zhongzhou State began to disappear. Li Tianlan became the only heavenly son of Zhongzhou State. No one said anything, even Kunlun City and the Wang family of Beihai. Because Li Tianlan was dead. The rise of the Purgatory of Heaven capital in East Island shocked the whole dark world. The mysterious deity of fearless Wang Tianzong, the three halls of Sanluo, life-prolonging, and Athanasi that had never appeared became the hottest topics in the dark world. And the appearance of deity also aroused the vigilance of all the big shots in the dark world. Some people had begun to guess the relationship between the Purgatory of Heaven capital and the Samsara palace. At this time, people suddenly remembered that the general trend in the dark world started from the destruction of Night Spirit and the Samsara palace's desire to lay the foundation for itself. More recently, it all started from the final battle between the master of Samsara Palace and Gu Xingyun, the god of war of Zhongzhou State. And all this was just the mysterious Samsara Palace's desire to get a bigger voice and more benefits in the dark world. But after everything was over, the Samsara Palace still kept silent. They still had no foundation. All this benefited the Purgatory of Heaven capital. It seemed to be a real help. The Purgatory of Heaven capital got a list. Although it was not the list that deity wanted the most, it was a list that made all the dark superpowers angry and even frightened. In less than 3 days after the final battle of Changdao, deity personally killed 4 superiors of the half-step invincible realm from the superpowers who had hidden in East Island and never left. Several secret agencies of the dark superpowers in East Island were completely destroyed. In just a few days, there were only the Purgatory of Heaven capital and the forces of East Island left in the land of East Island. The Mikado was delighted and announced that deity was the national god of war of East Island for the first time. And the dark superpowers of the entire East Island, because of the participation of the Purgatory of Heaven capital and after the final battle of Changdao, seemed to be more confident than before. As if in response to the arrogance of the Purgatory of Heaven capital and East Island, Gu Qianquan, the first elder of Kunlun City, and Sidu Tangyue, the governor of Sai City, returned to Zhongzhou State from Northern Europe and North America respectively. Several superpowers, led by Zhongzhou State, cooperated with each other at the first time. The currency war that had been in stalemate in East Island for many days completely broke out in one day. In the international market, the yen began to rise crazily, and the rise was almost desperate. It was September. The currency of East Island had appreciated nearly 6 times as much as before. Unimaginable wealth had been plundered by various countries and consortiums. Countless enterprises and groups in East Island had closed down one after another, and countless families had gone bankrupt. East Island was in chaos and suffering. Almost at the same time, Annan State submitted a petition to the United Nations to protest against Zhongzhou State. The president of Annan State went to the headquarters of the United Nations in person and accused Zhongzhou State of occupying the land of hundreds of miles around Annan State and stationing tens of thousands of troops. Annan State asked Zhongzhou State to withdraw its troops immediately. The explanation given by Zhongzhou State was to help Annan State suppress the rebellion. After Annan State made it clear that it refused Zhongzhou State's kindness, Zhongzhou State said that it would withdraw its troops within 24 hours. It didn't take 24 hours at all. The reorganized Thunderbolt Battalion only took a few minutes to take off their uniforms and burn them completely. 20,000 troops plus the Heaven Punishment Troop were stationed in the land that originally belonged to Annan State. From any point of view, they had nothing to do with Zhongzhou State. Dongqing Wudi began to form a new Thunderbolt Battalion. The aftermath of the general trend was still spreading, but there was no more turbulence on the whole. The midsummer gradually passed. Time went forward and it was autumn. The general trend was slowly dissipating, and the dispute was ending. There were only ripples left in the whole dark world. Chapter 261. This year, the final battle of Changdao seemed to be the dividing line of the entire dark world. The noise and chaos before the war formed a sharp contrast with the peace and quiet after the war. The Sky Academy and the Deep Sea Academy reopened. To be exact, it was the official start of school. The first semester of the 2 academies was roughly between April and May. After the entrance maneuver, all the courses would officially open after a short break. But this year's special situation broke the rule. Changdao postponed everything for a few months, and the official start of school was set in September. The students of the two academies returned to the academy to report, and the standard of the opening ceremony skyrocketed. President Li Huaqing, the leader of the academics of Zhongzhou State, came to the Sky Academy accompanied by Gu Xingyun, the governor of Kunlun City, and Yi Dongxing, the god of army of Zhongzhou State. Chen Fangqin, the leader of the Prince Group and prime minister of Zhongzhou State, went to the Deep Sea Academy accompanied by Marshal Qi Baizong, the minister of the army headquarters, and Marshal Dongqing Wudi, the commander of the Border Control Corps. Huading in September was still hot. The chaos that spread from the Sky Academy to the whole of Huading had passed, and the whole city was quiet. The entrance ceremony had been held a few months ago, and the class division had been completed. All the early procedures were directly skipped. The entire Sky Academy stood in phalanxes one after another according to the class. As the headmaster, Zhuang Huayang also had a square formation behind him. It was the smallest of all the contestants. There were only 17 people. Among them, 2 had lost their arms and 10 were seriously injured. Zhuang Huayang held a list of the dead in his hand. When Zhongzhou State conspired against East Island, both the Deep Sea Academy and the Sky Academy sent out their most elite students. The so-called most elite students naturally referred to the classes led by the 2 headmasters. After several months of killing, there were only 17 left from the original 50. The scene was solemn and sorrowful. The official opening of the school was at the gate of the Sky Academy without a gate. In front of the huge stone carved with the words "The Land of Heroes." The names of the previous victims of the Sky Academy were carved on the boulder. Zhuang Huayang stood in front of the boulder, holding a carving knife in his hand. He carved one name after another. The carving knife had red paint on it, and the carved names were also red as blood. The audience looked at Zhuang Huayang's movements with respect and did not speak. Zhuang Huayang engraved the names on the list one by one until there was only one left. He was a person that the entire world knew. He turned around and looked at the front of the crowd. President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State, who came to watch the ceremony, looked serious. Dressed in a black suit, he looked mournful and regretful. Li Huaqing turned his head and glanced at Gu Xingyun's face. Just as Gu Xingyun was about to make a move, Li Huaqing had already set his eyes on the face of a woman beside him. The woman was extremely beautiful, but her expression was somewhat wooden and empty. It was Situ Zhangyue, the governor of Sai City, who had returned to Huading from North America. Instead of returning to Sai City, she stayed in the Sky Academy to recuperate with tribulation. "Thank you, Zhangyue." Li Huaqing slowly opened his mouth, and his face seemed to struggle to form a strained smile. Situ Zhangyue nodded and waved her long sleeves. A gentle force suddenly lifted Li Huaqing up. His body rose until it was as tall as the boulder. Gu Xingyun's pupils shrank slightly, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth, but he did not speak. "A land of heroes." The word, "hero," was carved at the top of the stone tablet. The surroundings were empty. Li Huaqing stared at the boulder and held the carving knife in his hand tightly. Slowly, with great force, he carved the first stroke. He engraved it with great force, and the font was not small, so the name was very clear. There was a suffocating atmosphere on the scene. A name slowly took shape under Li Huaqing's carving knife and became neat, lively and vigorous. Li Tianlan. A name, a legend, a heavenly son. Under everyone's gaze, President Li Huaqing personally engraved the name of the last person who died in the Battle of the Sky Academy. It was engraved at the top of the stone tablet. It was clear and distinct. "Salute to the hero." Behind Li Huaqing came Yi Dongxing's roar with all his might. All the teachers and students, including Li Huaqing and Gu Xingyun, raised their hands to salute. The sun shone on the boulder. Outside the Sky Academy, the river and the sea converged. On the sunny ground, thousands of teachers and students raised their hands silently and forcefully, looking solemn. After the glory of the Li family was extinguished, Li Tianlan became the most dazzling young man in the whole dark world. Many people present had not even seen him, but everyone knew that if it weren't for him, the final battle of Changdao might have had a different result. The scene under the starry sky that day was really too complicated. If Li Tianlan hadn't appeared, what could Wang Tianzong and the Heaven Punishment Troop do? Wang Tianzong would have faced the siege of 5 invincible realm experts and 2 murderous weapons, including deity. At that time, the final battle had reached a critical point. When no one knew how terrifying deity's strength was, Wang Tianzong, who ranked first on the divine list, appeared in Changdao, which would make everyone instinctively unite as if they were facing a formidable enemy. 5 invincible realm experts, 2 murderous weapons, several half-step invincible realm experts, and more superiors at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. Even if Wang Tianzong had extraordinary abilities, how could he protect himself? If there was no Li Tianlan, what would happen to Wang Tianzong, Zhongzhou State, and the Wang family of Beihai? Just thinking about that kind of scene would make people's blood freeze. Similarly, Li Tianlan's achievements were also shocking. To some extent, he saved the stability of the special warfare system of Zhongzhou State. Even if it wasn't his intention, it didn't matter. What mattered was the result. He was a hero. He was a hero. Li Beidian quietly looked at Li Tianlan's name on the stone tablet, with confusion in his eyes. There were thousands of sword intents in Mount Shu. The 4 sword masters of Mount Shu were pure swordsmen. With Li Baitian's identity, he didn't need to come to the Sky Academy to study, and he wouldn't be assigned to the same dormitory as Li Tianlan, which seemed to be a coincidence. Everything had been arranged. Ning Qianxing should be the same. He was with Li Tianlan because of Dongqing Wudi's order. Li Beidian was entrusted by someone. First senior brother also knew about this. After a detailed understanding, he finally acquiesced in the fact that he and Yi Huayu came to the Sky Academy. The mentality of deliberately getting close to him and making friends was actually very subtle. But after a short contact, Li Beidian felt that Li Tianlan was a good person. They once fought against the Lu family in the entrance maneuver and went through thick and thin together. In Changdao, when he learned that he and Ning Qianxing were in danger, he rushed from Changdao to Zhongjing without hesitation and went through thick and thin together. Up to now, they hadn't been together for a long time, but it didn't matter how they got together. Now they were brothers and recognized each other, and that was enough. Ning Qianxing's body swayed a little in the crowd. His current injury was so serious that he could barely walk on the ground. Yu Qingyan supported him by his side and looked at the frightening name on the stone tablet with him. Yu Qingyan's eyes were a little red and swollen, as if she had been crying. But Ning Qianxing looked calm. He didn't believe that Li Tianlan was dead, even though Li Tianlan died in front of him with a sword through his chest. But Qin Weibai's reaction at that time seemed a little abnormal. The battlefield was too chaotic at that time. All kinds of sword energy whistled between heaven and earth, and all the scenes seemed to be faintly discernible. But somehow, maybe because he wasn't far from Li Tianlan, Ning Qianxing saw everything at that time. He didn't hear a lot of words, but he saw Qin Weibai's performance. The sword directly penetrated Li Tianlan's heart, and blood burst out under the starlight. At that moment, Qin Weibai was very calm. She seemed to have expected this kind of thing, or she had already expected that kind of result. When he took Li Tianlan from Saint's arms, his hands were trembling, but it wasn't fear, it was pure heartache. From the beginning to the end, he never felt the despair of losing a loved one from Qin Weibai. He just felt a deep sense of guilt and desolation. The people from the purgatory of Heaven Capital took away Li Tianlan's body. At that moment, Ning Qianxing, who was already seriously injured, vaguely saw Qin Weibai turn around. Extremely resolute. It was hard for him to understand the feelings between Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai. But if she hadn't carved the feelings into her bones and blood, she wouldn't have had that kind of look in her eyes when she held Li Tianlan's body. If everything was really irreversible, why would Qin Weibai turn around so resolutely and throw away Li Tianlan's body? Ning Qianxing thought of the text message he received this morning. The text message was from his father, who hadn't contacted him for several years. Now, because hundreds of fire-flaming realm elites from the Eastern Theater of Operations were lost in Changdao, the strength of the Eastern Theater of Operations was greatly reduced. His father should have been badly battered at this time. The general trend is clear. Do what you have to do. Ning Qianqing thought of the text message and turned to look at Li Beitian beside him. Do you really believe? Before he could finish his words, Li Beitian shook his head and interrupted him. That name is really an eyesore. Li Beitian looked at the stone tablet in front of him and said. Wang Yuetong was also looking at the stone tablet in front of her. Her eyes were dazed and blurred. The pride of the little princess of the Wang family of Beihai began to fade bit by bit. When Li Huaqing completely carved the name on the stone tablet, she couldn't help it anymore. She trembled slightly and burst into tears. In the days before Li Tianlan's departure, Wang Yuetong could feel his intimacy towards her and his occasional possessiveness. The two of them had slept in the same bed. All this showed that Li Tianlan seemed to have accepted her identity. An identity that didn't seem to be very glorious. But Wang Yuetong didn't care about this. Not because she really didn't care, but because she didn't think it was necessary. She really liked Li Tianlan. She liked him so much that she was willing to give herself to him completely. But Wang Yuetong didn't think about the future. Maybe she occasionally thought that the resentment between the Wang family and the Li family would slowly disappear because of her and Li Tianlan, but fantasy could only be fantasy after all. She was the little princess of the Wang family of Beihai and had a noble status. But in the rise and fall of the wealthy families and in the general trend of Zhongzhou state, it was insignificant. So Wang Yuetong didn't think about the future. She just liked Li Tianlan and wanted to be with him. Even if they would separate in the future, at least they had each other. The unseen future was right in front of her. She thought how ridiculous the so-called identity was. Maybe it was enough to be with him without regrets. Wang Yuetong took out her mobile phone with trembling hands. On the mobile phone's communication software were the messages that Wang Yuetong had sent to Li Tianlan in the past few months. They were all trivial things, like a little girl who liked to pester her boyfriend. Li Tianlan didn't reply to any of them. How could Li Tianlan reply when he was plotting against East Island in the general trend and he wasn't sure if he would have a huge conflict with the Wang family of Beihai now? He didn't reply, and he couldn't reply in the future. Wang Yuetong's eyes became more and more desolate. She couldn't imagine how resolute the cruel man was when he pulled out the sword for Qin Weibai in Changdao. She couldn't imagine his reluctance and melancholy after the sword light dissipated. Everything seemed to be doomed. She and he really had no future. Not separation, but death. Like was no longer like. She looked at the gradually blurring name on the stone tablet. Until this moment, Wang Yuetong realized that she really fell in love with that man. But he was already dead. The crowd began to disperse. Zhuang Huayang accompanied Li Huaqing, Gu Xingyun, and others to his office. Now the most awe-inspiring pair of sister and brother in the dark world of Zhongzhou state stayed where they were, quietly looking at the stone tablet in front of them. What will happen to him? Sidu Tsangyue looked at Li Tianlan's name and suddenly asked. Who? Tribulation's eyes were dim. He looked at his sister in white beside him and asked softly. The question was actually obvious. But Situ Tsangyue seemed to be stumped by her own question. After a long time, she said softly, What will happen to Dunlan? I don't know. Tribulation shook his head. He really didn't know. But Samsara is quiet. Saint has returned to Zhongzhou state. Tribulation thought for a moment and said again. Samsara was quiet, which was the best news. Samsara withdrew from Zhongzhou state. Sidu Tsangyue shook her head and did not continue. On the surface, Samsara did withdraw from Zhongzhou state, but it only lost Preqin International Group. Saint returned to Zhongzhou state. Combined with what they gained from this trip, Samsara could even be said to have taken another step forward in Zhongzhou state. Don't you want to ask something else? Tribulation said. What? Situ Tsangyue raised her eyebrows slightly. Ask him. Tribulation said calmly. Senluo life prolonging immortality, what's there to ask? Situ Tsangyue said indifferently. He is not him. Otherwise, how could Tianlan die? Not die. Tribulation corrected Situ Tsangyue's statement. He has died. There's nothing different about it. Situ Tsangyue shook her head. Tribulation said no more. A trace of blood flowed down the corner of his mouth. Under the silver mask, tribulation tightly pursed his lips, and his eyes seemed to become dimmer. What happened? Situ Tsongyue's eyes turned cold. Haven't you controlled the injury you got in Changdao? The injury in Changdao is under control. Tribulation smiled in a complicated tone. But the injury after the breakthrough can't be controlled. Even if I didn't break through at that time, I was sure that I could kill Miyamoto. But I could feel that it was the best chance for me to break through. I succeeded, and now I'm in the invincible realm. Tribulation laughed at himself. But it's better not to succeed. It's better not to enter the invincible realm. Isn't it ridiculous? Situ Tsangyue did not laugh. Her body slowly tightened, and she looked at Tribulation without saying a word. At noon in late summer and early autumn, the sun was blazing. Tribulation stood quietly, like a lonely shadow. The dark world completely calmed down. As the Battle of Changdao passed, the dark superpowers, which had different losses, also entered a period of recuperation. The conflicts in all aspects were suppressed. Even if there were some waves, they became the internal affairs of the superpowers and countries. But all the superpowers knew that the current situation was not over. The current calm was merely the brewing of an even greater storm. Zhongzhou State began to deal with its internal affairs in an orderly manner. All the follow-up events after the final battle of Changdao were solved one by one. Li Tianlan was a topic that couldn't be avoided. After a few days of preparation, Kunlun City of Zhongzhou State finally reluctantly took out 2 new lists. When they saw the list, many people suddenly realized that it was time to re-rank the top 10 experts of the young generation in Zhongzhou State. It was time to re-rank not only the top 10 experts of the young generation, but also the top 10 contemporary experts of Zhongzhou State. No one was surprised by the rankings on the 2 new lists. The pattern of the top 10 experts of the young generation was completely changed. Li Tianlan became the well-deserved first place and the first expert of the young generation in Zhongzhou State. Wang Xianxia followed him closely. He was no longer tied with Gu Hanshan. Gu Hanshan ranked 3rd. Dongqing Rushi moved back 1 place from the original ranking, but she surpassed Jiang Shangyu in front of her and ranked 4th. Li Beidian ranked 5th, second only to Jiang Shangyu. The 6th and 7th were a couple that surprised everyone. Ning Qianqing was on the list, while Yu Qingyan was on the list for the first time. The battle record of poisoning a thunder-shocking realm expert made this girl, who was good at using poison, famous in Zhongzhou State. If some people didn't think poison was a foreign object, Yu Qingyan's ranking would even be higher. The 8th was Du Hanyin, who had been on the list and then dropped out. After her wind vein was destroyed and mutated, it was no problem for her to be on the list. Wang Yuetong, who had never participated in the final battle of Changdao, dropped out of the list. The last 2 on the list were Qi Zhaoxi, the young master of Azura Path, who also didn't participate in the final battle of Changdao, and Zhongli Wuxin, the last disciple of the dean of the Deep Sea Academy. The list attracted a fair amount of attention, but not too many people talked about it. The list was updated every year, so it was obvious that it was not real. And the hottest topic was the ranking of the top 10 contemporary experts of the empire. The 10 people on the list, which was updated every 5 years, basically represented the peak combat capability of Zhongzhou State in the next 5 years. This was a big deal. The ranking of the young generation was fluctuating. The ranking of the older generation was also adjusting. And on this valuable list, Li Tianlan was also on the list. Wang Tianzong, Gu Xingyun, Sitizangyu. After the top 3, Li Tianlan ranked 4th among the top 10 experts of Zhongzhou State. Behind him was Tribulation, who had broken through the invincible realm. The first elder of Kunlun City, who was also in the invincible realm, had been pushed to the 6th. Wei Kunlun, the Nirvana Sword Master of Mount Shu, ranked 7th. Dongqing Wudi, the god of massacre of Zhongzhou State, ranked 8th. The name of Zhuang Huayang, the headmaster of the Sky Academy, did not appear on the list. The 9th place was also a young man. Wang Shengxiao from the Wang family of Beihai. With the combat capability he had shown in Changdao, no one questioned this ranking. The 10th place was given to Hua Qingfeng, the sect master of the Shadow Sect and the Shadow Guard of Zhongzhou State who had been in Yuzhou all year round. In terms of quality, the ranking this time only looked at the surface. There was no doubt that the high-end combat capability of Zhongzhou State had greatly increased. The top 6 all had the combat capability of the Invincible Realm. The young Wang Xianxia of the Thundershocking Realm entered the list, which gave people infinite expectations. But whether it was the list of the young generation or the list of the contemporary generation, one of them was always an illusion. Li Tianlan was already dead. In many people's eyes, these two lists had become the last traces of him in the world. But people who also believed that there would be miracles began to mention the things that Kunlun City had been unwilling to mention and publicize. Merit. Li Tianlan's merit. Everyone's merit. The Sky Academy had begun to count Li Tianlan's credits. Some people began to study the level of East Emperor Palace. The Sky Academy reported the calculated credits to Kunlun City. 80,000 credits. This was a number that was big enough to make anyone completely desperate. It broke the record of the highest credits since the establishment of the Sky Academy and the Deep Sea Academy. Kunlun City almost did not hesitate to reject the information reported by the Sky Academy. As a result, Headmaster Zhuang Huayang seemed to be angry and reported 100,000 credits for the second time. The credit statistics of the 2 special warfare academies had strict rules. But the problem was that Li Tianlan killed 2 Invincible Realm experts in Changdao and even took a murderous weapon, which could not be calculated at all. Even if Kunlun City rejected it, it dared not to reject Li Tianlan's credits alone, but to reject it with other people's. With Li Tianlan's merit at this time, even if Zhuang Huayang said 1 million credits, no one would say anything. Because Li Tianlan was a hero. Kunlun City was silent for 2 days and finally approved the credits reported by the Sky Academy. 100,000 credits. Of course, the 100,000 credits were not counted on Li Tianlan himself, but on the whole East Emperor Palace. But it didn't matter, because it was destined to be a number that could not be broken. The first place of this year's Sky Academy had been born in advance when the school started. Mount Dibbing. Wang Tianzong was also looking at the list in his hand. Sitting opposite him was Wang Xianxia. The 9th place, is a little flamboyant. Wang Tianzong shook the list in his hand. But it doesn't matter. You've grown up now. My requirement for you remains the same. It's still the same word, caution. Why don't you let Brother Jiang do it? Wang Xianxia took the list in Wang Tianzong's hand and asked. He looked at the names on it. Li Tianlan's name was on it. It was a little dazzling. It's not up to me to decide. Wang Tianzong shook his head. If Di Jiang appeared on the list, even if he couldn't suppress Gu Qianchuan, he would replace the ranking of Nirvana Swordmaster. But it was Kunlun City, the power center of the special warfare system of Zhongzhou State, that decided this kind of thing. No matter how powerful the Wang family of Beihai was, it couldn't control Gu Xingyun. Wang Xingxiao didn't say anything. He just quietly lowered his head and looked at the list in his hand, which seemed to be light and heavy. Not reconciled? Wang Tianzong asked, as if he knew what his son was thinking. Wang Xianxiao shook his head. After a moment of silence, he slowly said, his performance in Changdao that day deserves to be remembered by Zhongzhou State. I have nothing to say about ranking 4th. Remembered by Zhongzhou State. Wang Tianzong gently narrowed his eyes, lit a cigarette, and said blandly, not just Zhongzhou State. Wang Xingxiao's palm trembled. He suddenly remembered another ranking in the Dark World this year. A ranking that represented the peak combat capability in the entire Dark World. This ranking was also an important reason for the battle between the Master of Samsara Palace and Gu Xingyun. The ranking on the World Divine List. He looked at Wang Tianzong in disbelief. Nothing strange. Wang Tianzong's tone was indifferent. A 19-year-old Invincible Realm expert killed 2 Invincible Realm experts in one battle, one of whom was the 9th on the Divine List. Li Tianlan will definitely enter the Divine List and be remembered by the entire Dark World. That was a sword light that could amaze the entire Dark World, not because of how powerful it was, but because of the vitality before the end of the road. The owner of that sword light was only 19 years old. A 19-year-old invincible realm expert was destined to be forgotten in a short time. I've signed it. Wang Tianzong looked at Wang Xingxiao and said, the ranking on the world divine list required the joint signatures of all the known invincible realm experts in the world and all the superpowers. But when the opinions of the majority overwhelmed the minority, the ranking would take effect. And the ranking on the divine list was also related to the division of interests of the superpowers in the dark world. Li Tianlan now occupied a place on the divine list. He replaced Aldak, who was killed by him, and ranked 9th on the divine list. Wang Tianzong was still the first on the divine list. But Arsis, who was ranked 2nd, became 3rd. The deity of the purgatory of heaven capital replaced Arsis and became the 2nd master on the world divine list. Gu Xingyun's ranking dropped 1 place to the 5th. The master of Samsara Palace now ranked 4th. Sidihangyue, the hidden god of Zhongzhou state, rushed from 15th to 11th on the divine list. It was an interesting phenomenon. In Zhongzhou state, Siduzangyue ranked higher than Li Tianlan, but on the divine list, Li Tianlan ranked higher than Siduzangyue. But it didn't matter anymore. Wang Tianzong thought of the list that would spread to every corner of the dark world today, and his eyes were indifferent. The 15th invincible realm expert on the divine list. Now there was a dead man. It was a name that needed to be remembered by the dark world. But he had long forgotten about it. Because there was no point in remembering. What needed to be remembered was the past. You're tuning in to the Wang Lin's Journey YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.